My son was supposed to be in a private trauma lodge in Vermont. That is why every November, for 4 years straight, I wired his wife $35,000. Money grown out of my own land. Money pulled from cider sales, wholesale contracts, and the last good weather left in October. Money I sent because I believed my son was somewhere quiet, supervised, and slowly learning how to live with what he had done. Then one cold December night, just after the children at St. Luke's finished singing Silent Night, my 9-year-old granddaughter slid the folded concert program into my palm and whispered, "Grandpa, stop paying Mom." I bent down because I thought she wanted gum, or maybe to complain that the angel wings on her costume scratched her neck. Instead, she leaned so close I could feel the warmth of her breath against my ear and said, "Dad isn't in Vermont. Dad is in the old canning house behind our orchard." I remember the smell of wax and pine needles in that church. I remember the fake snow stuck to the hem of her white robe. I remember the copper-colored glitter on her small fingers because she had helped paint cardboard stars before the program began. Most of all, I remember what she said next. "When the copper spoon rings," she whispered, "he has to put his face to the wall." There are some sentences that do not enter your mind. They break in. For one strange second, I thought I had misheard her, that maybe children had been playing some invented game in the yard. Maybe she had seen some old movie and folded it badly into the truth. Maybe grief had finally gone to seed in me and started making ordinary words feel dangerous. But children do not lower their voices like that unless fear has taught them to. And they do not ask their grandfathers to stop paying for something unless they already know the money itself is part of the lie. I looked down at the program in my hand. On the outside, it had angels and candles and the name of the church in gold print. Inside, where the back page listed donor families and the order of songs, Ivy had written one sentence in green marker, in a hurry, with the kind of cramped hand children use when they are trying not to be caught. Please believe me this time. That was the moment the whole shape of my life tilted. Before I tell you what I found behind that orchard, I want to say 2 things. First, if you are listening because you like stories about revenge, stay with me. Revenge is in here, but it is not the first thing that matters. The first thing that matters is what people can do when they discover guilt is easier to control than chains. Second, this is a fictional story written to explore family betrayal, coercion, greed, and survival. The details are dramatized for storytelling, but the emotional truth is real enough to bruise. If you have ever ignored a bad feeling because the truth looked too expensive to touch, you will understand exactly how I lost 4 years. My name is Elias Rowan. I am 68 years old. I own Rowan Orchards and Cider in western Michigan, a place my grandfather planted with 600 apple trees and the stubborn fantasy that weather, debt, and family could all be managed with the same pair of hands. He was wrong, of course. Weather humbles you, debt teaches you, family can ruin you in places no one can see. I know that now. But for most of my life, I believed in roots. I believed that if you planted something right, pruned it honestly, and kept blight from spreading, the harvest would tell the truth about the tree. That is the kind of belief men like me are raised on. Land, labor, weather, result, cause and effect, hard work in, apples out. You can build your character around that kind of logic and never notice how helpless it makes you in the face of a really gifted liar. My wife Nora used to say orchards teach patience and arrogance at the same time. Patience because trees do not answer to panic. Arrogance because if you have one good decade, you start thinking every future season can still be corrected by effort. She understood me too well. Nora taught music at the elementary school in town for 26 years. She could get 30-second graders to sing in harmony and then come home and explain to me, gently but with absolute finality, why I was wrong about some insult I had not even realized I delivered at lunch. She had lungs that filled a room and hands that were always busy. She jarred peaches in August, froze basil in September, and left notes in odd places year-round. I found one tucked in my glove compartment 3 winters after she had written it. It said, "Put gas in this truck before you start talking about responsibility." She had that kind of humor, the kind that forgives you and corrects you in the same breath. She died 5 years ago. Not suddenly, not mercifully, not in a way I can talk about without still feeling cheated. Idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. That is a long enough name to feel like a system, but not a kind enough disease to leave room for dignity every day. She spent 2 years breathing through shorter and shorter futures while the rest of us arranged oxygen tubing, specialist visits, soup, blankets, and lies that sounded like hope. The worst part was not even the end. The worst part was how careful she became with her breath before the end. Like every sentence had to deserve the air it cost. She died believing our son was safe. That sentence follows me around the orchard to this day. I hear it when the frost alarms go off at 3 in the morning, I hear it when I walk past the old canning house and smell damp wood and rust. I hear it whenever I think about how many times she asked the right question and I gave the easier answer, because Nora did ask, more than once. But I am getting ahead of myself. I had one child, Gabriel Rowan, 37 years old when Ivy slipped that program into my hand. He was born during a thunderstorm in May, red-faced, furious, and heavy enough that the nurse laughed and told Nora she had delivered a farmhand, not a baby. He grew into exactly the kind of boy you imagine when you hear the words orchard son. Good with ladders, better with engines, quiet with strangers, dry with people he loved. The sort of kid who could fix an irrigation timer before he could write in cursive and would rather rebuild a gearbox than explain how he felt about anything. At 14, he was already pulling bins in the lower South Block. At 16, he knew which trees would set too much fruit if we did not thin early. At 23, he took over distribution software because he said the spreadsheet I used looked like I was trying to lose money on purpose. He had my shoulders and Nora's patience. That is a good combination in a man. Dangerous in a liar's sight, maybe, because it means he can endure more than he should, but good in a man. If you had met him at 30, before everything went wrong, you would have liked him, not because he was charming in the easy way. He was not. He was not one of those men who fill a room by intention. He filled space the way steady heat does. You only really notice it once it is gone. Then came Celeste. Some people are openly cold. Those are easy. You protect yourself early, and the rest writes itself. Celeste was worse. Celeste was polished, gracious, organized. She remembered birthdays, sent handwritten thank you cards, stood just slightly too close when speaking so you felt rude for doubting her, and had a way of making concern sound like generosity. She never raised her voice, never let herself look rattled for long, never pushed hard enough in public to leave fingerprints on the moment. Nora distrusted her before I did. One Sunday after lunch, years before any of this, I was loading plates into the dishwasher while Celeste and Gabriel were out in the side yard with a baby monitor and Ivy in a stroller. Nora dried a bowl, set it down, and said, "She's always curating the atmosphere." I laughed because I thought that sounded like teacher nonsense. Nora looked at me over the rim of her glasses and said, "No, Eli, I mean it. She does not live in a room. She arranges how a room will remember her." I should have paid attention, but men like me forgive polish too easily. We mistake self-control for character. We mistake composure for innocence. Celeste married Gabriel in early October under a tent strung between 2 rows of Cortland apples. The weather held. The leaves were just beginning to turn. Nora cried softly during the vows and then told me later the cider was too sweet and the florist had overdone the eucalyptus. That was our marriage. Romance and quality control holding hands. Ivy came 3 years later. She was thin, serious, watchful, and somehow funny in a way that made you feel she already understood half the room and was too polite to mention it. As a toddler, she lined up wooden animals by size and screamed if anyone moved the fox. At 6, she asked why adults say they are fine when their eyes are not agreeing. At 8, she began drawing little houses with too many windows and trees with faces. Nora adored her instantly. She used to say Ivy had the expression of a tiny magistrate and the heart of a barn cat, suspicious until earned, loyal after. If anyone had told me then that the child would one day become the first person in our family brave enough to tell the truth plainly, I would have believed it. I just would not have believed the shape the truth had taken. The lie that took my son began, like rot often does, in a season that already had enough pressure in it to hide new damage. It was the 4th hard year in a row, late frost in April, thin set in the Honeycrisps, freight rates up, a cider contract hanging on margins too tight to be kind. We had begun exploring event business because Celeste insisted the orchard was emotionally underleveraged, which is a phrase that still makes my teeth ache when I think about it. That was how Marin Bell entered the picture. Marin was Celeste's older cousin, though you would never guess it from how they behaved together. Celeste moved around Marin with the caution of a woman standing too close to a mirror she does not fully control. Marin had a fast laugh, good cheekbones, and the slippery confidence of someone who has spent a lot of years being forgiven because she stays entertaining. She arrived from Chicago calling herself a branding consultant. At first, I thought that meant logos and social media and other things I am content never to understand in full. What it really meant was she wanted to help Celeste turn the East Acreage, the old tasting shed, and the barn complex into a resort wedding business with seasonal luxury cabins. Gabriel hated the idea immediately. Not because he was against growth. He was the one who convinced me to automate line packing and overhaul direct shipping. He hated it because the proposal included cutting 27 acres of producing trees, rerouting service lanes and borrowing against a future that only looked safe if no hail, disease, rate shock, labor shortage, or human stupidity ever touched us again. Orchards punish fantasy. That was Gabriel's position. Mine too, though I was slower about saying it out loud because by then Nora's breathing had worsened and I was too tired to fight every bad idea at full strength. Celeste never forgave us for slowing the plan down. I know that now too. Back then I thought we were having a business disagreement. A family one maybe. The kind that passes once money settles into the lanes real work allows. I had no idea I was watching motive take root. The official story of Gabriel's collapse arrived 9 months after Nora died. That timing matters. Everything cruel in this story understood timing. 9 months after we buried Nora, Celeste called me just after 10 at night. Her voice was controlled in the exact wrong way, not calm, managed. Anyone who has spent a lifetime around breakdowns of weather, machinery, money, and people knows the difference. True panic spills. It stammers. It forgets sequence. Celeste sounded like someone reading from the version of fear that would produce the most useful listener. She said there had been an incident in the old canning house. That building sat behind the east orchard, half storage and half shame by then. My grandmother used to preserve peaches there in copper kettles so large I thought as a boy they could boil a pig. Later my father stored barrels in it. Later still we used it for seasonal overflow, seed trays, broken ladders, and boxes no one had the heart to throw out. Stone sink, long table, narrow back room, old radiator, one window that stuck every November, and a service door that swelled in wet weather. Not a good place for a family argument. A perfect place for one, if you ask evil. When I arrived that night, the yard lights behind the house were on. Gabriel was sitting on the back steps with blood on one cuff and both hands hanging between his knees. He looked up when I came, but not all the way. Like it took effort to bring the rest of the world into focus. I said his name. He blinked once and said, "Dad, I think I ruined everything." Not a good beginning. Celeste met me before I could reach him. She caught my elbow and pulled me off the line of sight between us like she was protecting a witness. "There was an argument with Marin," she said. "He pushed her. She hit the stone sink. Adrian is with her now." Adrian. That was the first time she used his first name around me, as though that should sound ordinary. Dr. Adrian Vale was a trauma psychiatrist with a satellite practice outside Grand Rapids, and the kind of polished gentleness that always makes older men either trust him too fast or hate him instantly. I should have hated him instantly. Instead, I let his degree do too much work in my mind. He came out of the canning house 10 minutes later with his sleeves rolled and his face arranged in professional sorrow. Not devastation, not urgency, sorrow. That detail came back to me later so hard it felt like punishment. If a woman has just died in a building behind someone's house, the man emerging from it should not look composed enough to host a fundraiser. But that night he did. He spoke quietly, asked whether Gabriel had any prior panic episodes, any dissociative symptoms, any sleep loss, any history of catastrophic self-blame. What a question, as though he had already decided which drawer to place my son in. I said Gabriel had been under pressure, which was true. The orchard was squeezed. My wife was dead. Celeste had been pushing land proposals. Marin had been needling him for weeks over development and investor interest. But pressure is not a diagnosis. Pressure is just weather in a man's chest until someone decides to monetize it. Adrian said Marin's condition was not survivable. That is the exact phrase. Not dead, not gone. Not call the sheriff, not call an ambulance even. Not survivable. Language like that is a curtain. It hides the doorway you should already be running through. I asked where the paramedics were. Celeste answered before Adrian did. Marin's brother has been contacted, she said. Adrian is handling the medical side and the legal exposure. We need to think carefully before we ignite a public disaster that destroys Gabriel before he can even understand what happened. There should have been sirens. There should have been officers. There should have been bright yellow tape and questions and papers and real-world friction. Instead, there was only yard light, cold air, my son shaking on the back steps, and 2 polished people explaining why immediate visibility would be the cruelest possible response. Gabriel kept saying he had shoved her, that he did not mean for her to hit the stone, that there was too much blood, that she was still when he went to lift her. He said it over and over like the repetition itself might file the sharp edges off what he had done. Then Adrian crouched in front of him and used the tone. I know that tone now. Measured, deep, almost fatherly. The tone of a man applying force through calm. "Gabriel, look at me," he said. "If you want any chance of protecting Ivy from what comes next, you need to let the people who are still thinking clearly contain this." Contain. Another soft word hiding a cage. I wish I could tell you I saw it then. I did not. What I saw was my son unraveling. By dawn, Gabriel had been moved, not arrested, not hospitalized openly, moved. Adrian and Celeste called it emergency stabilization. Said he was in acute moral shock, which sounds like a sermon stitched to a billing code. Said he was spiraling into self-annihilating guilt and could make things catastrophically worse if questioned publicly in that state. Said Marin's family wanted discretion. Said there were civil risks, criminal risks, press risks, custody risks, and that the only humane path was temporary confidential treatment while parallel matters were being quietly managed. Parallel matters. For months after that, I would hear the phrase in my sleep and think it sounded like a hallway with no doors. I was not thinking well then either. Nora was gone less than a year. I was drinking too much coffee, sleeping too little, and still waking some mornings expecting to hear her oxygen machine before memory corrected me. The orchard was heading into winter. My son had confessed in some broken half-formed way to hurting a woman badly enough that an expensive doctor looked at me with grave eyes. And Celeste kept bringing Ivy to the house with just enough steadiness that I mistook her composure for sacrifice. That is how some people survive scrutiny. They wrap themselves in logistics while everyone else drowns in emotion. The first invoice came 3 weeks later. Private trauma lodge in Vermont, residential psychiatric stabilization, restricted access due to patient fragility, quarterly retainer, specialty supervision not covered by insurance, $40,000. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with the invoice in one hand and Nora's old preserving ledger in the other because the checkbook had been kept in the same drawer. I remember thinking how obscene it was that grief and bookkeeping used the same pen. I called Celeste and asked why a lodge in Vermont? Why not Michigan? Why so far? Why so expensive? Why no direct contact? She cried then, not loudly, just enough. Said Gabriel could not bear Ivy's name spoken out loud without starting to gag. Said he had tried to hit his own head against a wall twice. Said Adrian believed family contact would cement his guilt into something permanent. Said if I wanted my son back, I needed to stop reaching for the version of him I still understood. That line landed because it was almost true. The best lies always contain a usable rib of truth. Adrian supported it. Sent typed summaries every few weeks. Minimal but purposeful. Patient remains deeply remorseful. Environmental triggers still high. Family voice contact currently contraindicated. Child-linked themes provoking destabilization. Gradual reintegration possible if compliance continues. Compliance. Notice how quickly treatment language starts sounding like training language once the heart of it goes bad. Nora was still alive for the first months of this arrangement. Thinner then, softer voiced, walking only from bedroom to kitchen and back without resting. She read Adrian's summaries once, set them down, and asked me, "Do you know what actual place he is in?" "I know enough," I said. She looked at me for a very long time, not angry, worse than angry, disappointed in a quiet way that makes you hear your own answer more clearly than before. "That was not my question, Eli," she said. I did not answer better the second time either. That failure cost me more than money. Because once Nora got sicker, the focus shifted. Oxygen, hospice consultations, soup she could still swallow, music low in the evenings because too much sound exhausted her. Her body was leaving and all the rest of us rearranged ourselves around the fact like furniture in a room with a cracked floor. In that season, Celeste became useful. That was part of her genius. She brought Ivy over with casseroles. She took over donor outreach for the Orchard's music scholarship in Nora's name. She sent printed updates from Adrian as if she were delivering weather bulletins from a distant front. Sometimes Gabriel wrote short notes, or what I believed were his notes. "I'm trying. Tell Dad not to worry about the money. Do not let Ivy see me like this. Thank him for the applesauce. The handwriting was his, at least close enough to be. Maybe it truly was. That is one of the ugliest things about long manipulation. Not every piece is fake. The real and the staged weave together until trust itself becomes contaminated." Nora died still believing Gabriel was in treatment, but a week before the end, while the oxygen hummed and snow tapped against the bedroom window, she asked me one last time whether I had ever seen the place with my own eyes. I told her Adrian said visits would set him back. She turned her head on the pillow and said, with almost no breath left in her, "That doctor keeps describing your son the way people describe a horse they want you to stop touching." I laughed once because it was Nora, and she could still surprise me with the shape of her clarity, even dying. Then I told her she needed to rest. She closed her eyes and said, "Sometimes rest is just what other people ask from the witness." I think about that sentence nearly every day. After she died, my payments changed shape. The quarterly lodge retainer became an annual transfer. Celeste said a single post-harvest payment was more stable, less disruptive, easier to budget around, easier for Gabriel too because money talk heightened his shame. There is no upper limit to what a guilty father will pay if you convince him that asking basic questions might injure his son. So every November, after the last pressing and before year-end taxes, I sent $35,000. 1 year early because Adrian recommended expanded winter support. 1 year in 2 installments because Gabriel had supposedly experienced anniversary deterioration around the date of Marin's injury. 1 year with an extra $8,000 added because Ivy had started asking direct questions, and Celeste said managing that emotional fallout was stretching their resources. The money became seasonal, as natural in my mind as pruning. First frost, then payment. Fallen leaves, then payment. The final bins to the wholesaler, then payment. How many lies become invisible simply because they learn to arrive on schedule? Over time, the story shifted again. Gabriel was no longer in strict residential treatment. He had transitioned, Adrian said, into a supervised private recovery environment, still under care, still medically fragile, still nowhere near ready for family reintegration, but making selective progress. That should have been the point where I demanded an address. Instead, I translated it into something softer and less dangerous. A lakeside rental, maybe. A small cottage with a nurse. A quiet place where shame could weather itself down into something a man could live with. You can lose years that way. Not by ignoring a lie, by improving it for the liar. Meanwhile, Ivy kept growing. Children do not stop becoming themselves just because the adults around them are telling profitable stories. She learned to read music, became suspicious of pea soup, drew the orchard exactly wrong in ways that somehow made it more honest. Started asking why daddy could write but never call. Why therapists were allowed to decide who children missed. Why mom changed the subject when the old canning house came up. I heard those questions. I answered around them. That is another kind of guilt, not the kind that gets weaponized against you. The kind you willingly accumulate because confronting the truth would require admitting how much of your own life you outsource to easier explanations. Then came the Christmas concert, the angel robe, the green marker, the whisper, "Please believe me this time." Those were the words that hurt worst, maybe. Not because they exposed the lie, because they told me she had probably tried to say it before, and I had failed the test without even recognizing it. I took Ivy home after the concert because Celeste had volunteered to help stack chairs and return costume boxes. Or that was what she said. The drive to their house was only 12 minutes, but it felt longer because I had to do it carefully. You cannot interrogate a frightened child the way adults interrogate one another. Push too hard and the truth curls up. Ask too softly and it slides away, because children assume you will choose comfort over them again. So I drove slowly through town with the heater too high and the folded program on my lap, and asked the kinds of questions that leave doors open. "When did you write that note?" I said. "This morning." "Why this morning?" "Because the concert was loud and Mom doesn't like when I whisper in the house." Not a good answer. Not because it was impossible, because children explain around fear before they explain into it. "Have you seen Dad in the canning house?" "Yes." "How many times?" "A lot." "Does Mom know you've seen him?" A pause, then a nod. "That's not very specific, Bean." She stared out the windshield and said, "She says I'm helping if I follow the rules." What rules? The two most dangerous words in a child's mouth. What rules? Not going in unless she says, not saying his name too loud, not asking him big questions because he gets worse if I make him remember. It took effort not to pull the truck over right there. "Who told you that?" "Mom, and Dr. Vale, and Dad too sometimes, but he says it different." "How different?" "He says sorry first." There are apologies so practiced they become furniture in a house. You stop hearing them as language and start hearing them as the price of staying loved. By the time we turned into Celeste's driveway, I knew enough to be sick and nowhere near enough to act safely. The house looked normal. That was the obscene part. Porch light on, wreath on the door, mudroom lamp glowing, the kind of ordinary December domestic scene that makes the human mind hesitate before it labels anything inside it as monstrous. I parked and cut the engine. "Bean," I said, keeping my voice easy. "Where exactly is Dad?" She pointed without looking. Past the side yard, past the bare lilac hedge, toward the stand of old sugar maples at the edge of the east block. "The canning house," she said. "Back there." I knew the building. Of course I did. Knew the cracked concrete path, the busted gutter on the north side, the stacked crates that should have been thrown away 10 years earlier, the smell of old syrup and damp wood it held every spring. But I had not really looked at it in years. Not with attention. Not as part of the family's living architecture. Just one more outbuilding on land that had too many stories already nailed into it. That night I looked, and there it was. The canning house. Window dark from the front, side light on low, and hanging beside the service door, catching the porch glow from the house just enough to shine, was one of Nora's old copper preserving spoons. Not in a kitchen, not on a wall rack, hanging on a nail outside a locked building. Ivy saw where my eyes went and whispered, "That's the one." I did not know whether she meant the spoon or the lie or the whole terrible arrangement that linked them. Maybe all three. We walked to the porch. Celeste opened the door before I knocked. She had already changed out of her church clothes into a cream sweater and dark jeans, hair pulled back, lip color gone, face arranged into concern. "How was the concert?" she asked Ivy. "Fine," Ivy said too quickly. That alone would have bothered me, even if everything else had not already cracked. Celeste looked at me and smiled the way people smile when they think they are still managing the temperature of the room. "Thank you for bringing her home. It was a madhouse at the church." I handed her the little paper star Ivy had made after the program because my hands needed something ordinary to do. Then, from the darkness behind the house, came a thin metallic sound. One sharp strike. Then another. The copper spoon ringing against pipe or nail, I could not tell which, but I knew immediately that Ivy had not invented anything. My granddaughter went still beside me, not mildly startled. Still, children can mimic a lot. They cannot fake that kind of body memory. I turned my head toward the yard, toward the Canning house shadow. Celeste's hand landed on Ivy's shoulder instantly. "Inside," she said, softly enough to pass for calm. Ivy nodded and went. I watched her disappear down the hall. Then I looked back at Celeste and asked the first direct question I had asked her in years. "What's the spoon for?" Not a flicker, not a blink. She glanced toward the side yard and smiled lightly. "Oh, that? The old thing keeps the service latch from sticking if I knock the ice loose in cold weather." Bad answer. Too fast. And Gabriel? There, the smallest hitch. The one you miss if you are still invested in the lie. The one you never unsee once you are not. "What about him?" she asked. "Can I see him?" Her expression did not harden exactly. It clarified. "You know Adrian has been explicit about what contact does to him." "No," I said. "I know what you and Adrian have both been saying." A long silence followed. Then she lowered her voice like she was speaking to a difficult relative at a funeral. "Elias, he had a rough week. The holidays make him worse. Ivy's questions make him worse. Your presence can still destabilize him. Please don't turn your guilt into one more demand he has to survive." There it was, that trick. Not answering the question, rewriting the motive beneath it. Before I could speak again, she added, almost as an afterthought, "And I need to talk to you about support. Adrian wants the winter transfer before New Year's this time. Gabriel has needed more supervision than expected. More supervision." A child goes rigid at a sound in the yard, and the mother asks for money in the same breath. I looked past her shoulder toward the hallway where Ivy had disappeared, then toward the yard where the Canning house sat, then back at Celeste. "I'll think about it," I said. That was not a phrase she liked. People who live on managed certainty hate being told somebody needs to think. She stepped aside in the doorway, the smallest fraction, enough to perform politeness without really inviting me in, and said, "Please do it quickly. His stability depends on a lot you don't always see." That sentence nearly made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because the truth was suddenly standing so close to it. His stability depends on a lot you don't always see. Yes, it did. I drove home with the window cracked, even though the air hurt my teeth. I needed cold, needed something sharp that belonged to the weather and not to language. At the house, I did not take my coat off for nearly half an hour. I just stood in the kitchen staring at Nora's old kettle and the bowl of apples on the table, and the folded program laid out beside my keys like evidence I had not yet earned the right to touch. Then I did what men like me always do when the emotional structure of life fails. I started building a paper one, invoices, transfer confirmations, typed summaries from Adrian, text messages from Celeste, holiday cards, copies of notes supposedly written by Gabriel, a folder from my accountant marked family support, another from the year after Nora died marked Vermont care, a legal pad, 3 pens, a calculator I did not need but put there anyway because grief and arithmetic both prefer the comfort of tools. I worked until after midnight. At first I was still reading like a father, looking for reassurance, looking for texture of care, looking for narrative. Then somewhere around 1 a.m, with a glass of cold coffee in my hand and Nora's empty chair across from me, I changed. Not emotionally, mechanically. I started reading like an orchardist reads blight reports, for pattern, for spread, for things repeating too cleanly. The language in Adrian's summaries did not evolve much. That bothered me. Human suffering shifts. Treatment notes usually move with it. But these summaries kept circling the same phrases as if the patient were less a person than a market segment. Restricted child exposure, environmental guilt stimulus, identity destabilization, conditional progress, high family risk load, behavioral containment, containment again, always containment. Then the invoices. The letterhead changed once in small ways that did not make sense. Same lodge name, same categories, different spacing, different logo weight, different title line for Adrian. A true institutional form usually changes because systems change. These looked like somebody had revised a template when memory got lazy. At 2:15, I found something else. Not proof, just a bruise on the story. One annual transfer had been wired to an account that did not match the others. Same last 4 digits on my paperwork? No. Different routing institution entirely. When I held the pages side by side, I realized Celeste had sent a temporary processing update that year because the lodge's billing service had supposedly changed. I did not remember thinking hard about it at the time. I remembered signing. That is another way people lose their lives, by mistaking administrative changes for boring reality. At 3, I called Miriam Doyle. I should tell you about Miriam, because without her I might still be standing in my own kitchen telling myself I needed just one more document before the truth was allowed to become ugly. Miriam had been Nora's closest friend since college and our family attorney for most of my adult life. Estate work, property agreements, employment disputes, neighbor nonsense, the slow legal weather that settles over anyone who owns land long enough. She was 65, compact, silver-haired, and had a voice that made weak men feel they had been assigned homework. She also had the useful habit of disliking theater. Not humor, theater, performative innocence, procedural fog, any sentence that used too many syllables to avoid naming its subject. When I told her I needed her first thing in the morning because I thought I had financed a lie for 4 years, she did not waste time asking whether I had slept. She said, "Do not send another dollar." Put every piece of paper on the table. And Eli? If this turns out to be what I think it is, do not confront Celeste alone while you are still making shocked noises instead of good decisions. That is how the real investigation began. Not with law, not with police, with a widow's best friend telling me to stop being surprised and start being useful. Miriam arrived at 8:10 carrying a leather bag, 2 file folders, and the kind of expression people wear when they already suspect the worst but are still willing to let facts earn the last word. She looked at the table once and said, "Well, either grief made everyone lazy, or someone counted on you loving your son more than you love sequence." Both were true, as it turned out. Miriam read the paperwork the way some surgeons touch a body before the first cut. No drama, no false optimism. She lined things up by date, then by sender, then by category. She separated Adrian's summaries from Celeste's texts, my transfers from their billing requests, and the handwritten notes from Gabriel into a smaller pile she kept close to her elbow. For nearly 40 minutes, the only sounds in my kitchen were paper, kettle, and Miriam making tiny irritated noises every time she found something sloppy. Then she held up 2 summaries and said, "He overuses the same sentence." Who? Adrian. Family voice exposure remains clinically contraindicated. It appears 6 times in 2 years. A real clinician may repeat a concept. He does not usually repeat it like branding. She kept reading. At one point, she picked up the notes Gabriel had supposedly sent and said, "The handwriting may be his. The language is not always." I looked up from the transfer log. "What do you mean?" She pointed to one line. "Thank Dad for maintaining continuity." Gabriel was many things. Soft around his daughter, stubborn about land, too willing to carry shame once it stuck. But he was not a man who would thank his father for maintaining continuity. He would have written, "Thanks for the money," or "Sorry again," or "Don't keep paying this much." Real people sound different from people being filtered through useful phrasing. Miriam then did the thing I should have done years earlier. She ignored the story and checked the structure. Billing address, provider registration, facility licensing, corporate filings, treatment entity history, mail service records, routing institutions. By 11:30, the Vermont Lodge had begun to rot. The facility existed. That was the first ugly relief. I had not been paying into pure air. There really was a trauma lodge in Vermont. There really had been an intake under Gabriel's name, but it had ended years earlier. Miriam found the discharge reference through a connected provider directory and a licensing update that should have meant nothing to me, but everything to someone who reads systems for a living. Gabriel Rowan had been discharged from formal residential care 3 years and 9 months earlier. Disposition. Transition to supervised private recovery residence under physician oversight. I read the line 3 times and still did not trust my own eyes. Supervised where? I asked. Miriam turned the page toward me. The address listed under private residence was Celeste's home. Not Vermont, not a cottage, not a distant therapeutic environment. Their house. The same property with the canning house behind it and my granddaughter going stiff at the sound of a spoon. I sat down so hard the chair barked across the floor. That's their address. I know. You're sure? Very. Then why the hell have I been paying Vermont? Because someone kept invoicing you as if the facility remained active or as if Adrian's affiliated care somehow justified using the lodge brand as cover. Neither possibility is kind. The room changed after that, not metaphorically, actually changed. Air different, light different. The walls of my kitchen suddenly aware of me in a way they had not been an hour earlier. Miriam kept going. The provider oversight forms attached to discharge required monthly review entries. Those entries, where they existed, routed through Adrian Vale's private practice group, not the Vermont Lodge. There was no independent case manager after year one, no outside audit, no state review that actually described ongoing confinement. Just Adrian's language, Celeste's explanations, my money, and the assumption that love would keep me from asking for the scaffolding underneath the story. At 12:45, Miriam found the first name that turned suspicion into shape. Vale Behavioral Stewardship, LLC. What is that? I asked. Administrative shell, she said. Or maybe a real company doing very questionable things. Either way, it is linked to one of the alternate routing accounts you paid in year 3. She printed filings. Then more. Then property records tied to a mailing box outside Grand Rapids. Then another corporate address that linked back, through a layered set of names and one extremely stupid registered agent error, to a condo purchased 2 years earlier on Lake Michigan. Who owns it? I asked. She kept reading. Not Adrian directly, not Celeste directly, but the LLC nest is thin enough that someone got either arrogant or tired. Arrogance is what long success becomes when fear stops challenging it often enough. By mid-afternoon, we had a board on the kitchen wall, not a dramatic television board with red yarn and photographs, just butcher paper taped beside Nora's old recipe calendar and a neat legal handwriting names, dates, accounts, addresses, and arrows until my home looked like a place people come to after someone has gone missing. Which, I suppose, was true. He had gone missing, only not in the way I had believed. We still did not have proof of what was happening inside the canning house. We did not know whether Gabriel was living there willingly under manipulation or outright confinement under structure and fear. We did not know how much Adrian knew, how much Celeste controlled directly, or whether police would hear the story and treat it as family insanity with paperwork. So Miriam said the words that carried us into the next phase. We watch before we move. That evening we parked half a block down from Celeste's house in Miriam's Subaru because my truck was too recognizable, and righteous men in recognizable trucks are one of the easiest species in America to spot. The orchard looked ordinary in winter, rose black against the fading sky, patches of old snow at the fence lines. The canning house sitting low and dark behind the east block with its roof line half hidden by bare limbs. The main house glowing warm from inside, kitchen lit, living room lit, a television flickering in some upstairs room. We watched. At 6:10, Ivy's bedroom light came on. At 6:28, Celeste crossed the kitchen with a tray. At 6:32, she put on a coat. At 6:34, she walked out the side door and followed the concrete path toward the canning house. She did not carry food like someone feeding a worker. She carried it like someone maintaining a system. I know how odd that sounds, but men who have spent their lives watching routines develop around labor know the difference. A meal for a worker has casual weight to it. A tray for control has arrangement, pill cup, glass, covered bowl, napkin folded too neatly, nothing accidental. She reached the canning house, knocked once, and lifted the copper spoon from its nail. 2 light taps against the exposed radiator pipe that ran along the outer wall. Then she unlocked the door and disappeared inside. My throat closed so hard I thought I might choke on the air itself. Miriam lowered the binoculars and said very softly, "That is not therapeutic." No. It was not. 7 minutes later, Celeste came out carrying the same tray. The bowl was empty. The pill cup was gone. The spoon was back on its nail. I watched her return to the house without once looking over her shoulder. At 6:51, the curtain on the side window of the canning house shifted. Only slightly, but enough. A silhouette stood there. Tall. Still. Shoulders I knew, even after years of absence, because a father memorizes the outline of his child the way a farmer memorizes the good trees after a hailstorm. My son was less than 70 yards from his own daughter, and I had been wiring his jailer harvest money every fall. I pressed my hand so hard against the dashboard my palm left sweat on the vinyl. At 7:12, the copper spoon rang once. The silhouette vanished immediately. That sound did something terrible to me. Not because it was loud, because it worked. By 8, I had moved through disbelief and arrived somewhere flatter. Not calm, not fury, something colder. At home, I could not sit, could not eat, could not even form the kind of prayer older men reach for when their vocabulary fails. I kept hearing the tap of spoon on pipe and seeing the silhouette disappear. Miriam, who had known me long enough to understand when silence was dangerous, stayed until nearly 10. Then at the door she said, "Tomorrow we get inside, but we do not do it stupidly." Frank Delaney entered the story the next day. Retired locksmith, former volunteer fireman, bad knee, good hearing, the sort of man who can open a padlock and then spend 30 minutes explaining why the person who bought it should have been embarrassed. He owed Miriam a favor involving a probate fight, a shed, and 3 nephews who had apparently confused inheritance with scavenging. I did not ask for the full version. All I needed to know was that he disliked people who hid ugly things behind ordinary doors. We chose Thursday because Celeste took Ivy to choir and Adrian usually came Fridays. At 4:17, Miriam texted me one word, now. By 4:30, we were behind the hedge line on the north side of the property. The house was empty, no movement, no car in the drive, no lights on in the canning house. Frank crouched by the service door, examined the lock, and muttered, "Cheap once, mean later. Story of American hardware." 30 seconds later, the door clicked open. My hand was on the frame before my mind caught up. The smell hit first. Damp wood, bleach, medication, stale heat, something faintly sweet and metallic under it all, like syrup spilled years ago and never fully gone. The room had been arranged to look kinder than it was. That enraged me instantly. A narrow bed with a folded blanket, a lamp, a desk, shelves with paperbacks, a small refrigerator, a rug over the old plank floor, one framed print of a winter lake, a potted fern someone had clearly overwatered, captivity dressed as convalescence. Then I saw the window latches, mounted on the outside, then the interior partition, newer than the rest of the building, cutting the back third into a smaller room with a digital lock on the inward side. Then the copper spoon resting on the desk like a tool. Then the binders, 3 of them, black, labeled in clean block print. Behavior review, contact eligibility, reflection compliance. I went cold all over. Miriam took the binders. Frank checked the rear window. I moved deeper inside like a man walking through the remains of his own judgment. Pinned above the desk were drawings in a child's hand, apples, a dog that did not exist, a blue house with red windows, a line of little stick figures holding hands, and one drawing that nearly dropped me where I stood. 3 trees beside a square building with smoke coming out the top and a single face in the window. Across the top, in purple crayon, Ivy had written, "Daddy's Quiet House." On the back of one drawing, in Gabriel's handwriting, were 6 words. "I hear you when you sing." That was the first time I had to close my eyes just to remain standing, because it told me he was near enough to hear choir practice from the yard or the open windows, near enough to know the life of his child in fragments, far enough or controlled enough that fragments were all he was allowed. Miriam opened the behavior binder. What she read from it still lives under my skin. Patient responsive to cue object, child proximity remains useful incentive. Reduce spontaneous memory loops by redirecting to duty, shame, and safety themes. If father inquiry escalates, reinforce burden narrative. Patient calms more quickly after wall orientation. Wall orientation, not a phrase from medicine, a phrase from control wearing a clean shirt. Then we heard a sound from behind the partition, a chair leg moving across floor. The back room. I stood so still I could hear my own pulse. Then, from behind the locked interior door, in a voice thinned by caution and repetition, my son said, "Celeste." Not hello, not who is it. Celeste. Miriam looked at me once. I looked at the door. Then I stepped forward and said the words I had been paying 4 years not to need. "No, it's me." Silence. Then very carefully, "Dad?" There are moments when a man can feel the exact shape of his heart failing to do the thing it has done quietly his whole life. That was one. I reached for the keypad on the inner door and stopped because my fingers had started shaking hard enough to miss the buttons. Frank moved beside me. "Need the lock open?" he asked quietly. I nodded without taking my eyes off the door. He examined the housing once and said with disgusted admiration, "They upgraded the inside." Of course they did. 30 seconds later, he had the panel open and the latch released. When the door swung inward, the back room revealed itself a little at a time. Narrower than the outer room, no proper window, just a high vent and one sealed pane that let in light, but not much else. A single bed, small sink, straight-back chair, shelf of notebooks, a folded blanket, no private mess, no evidence of ordinary life spilling where it chose. Everything too arranged, too correct, too supervised. And Gabriel. He was sitting on the edge of the bed with both hands clasped so hard between his knees I thought the bones might crack. He was thinner than I had imagined, though not starved. That almost made it worse. Whoever had done this understood exactly how much care keeps cruelty deniable. His hair was longer than he ever wore it and badly cut at the ends. Not wild, managed. His face had narrowed. His beard was close trimmed in the way men look when somebody else decides what kind of presentable they are allowed to be. Gray sweatshirt, dark pants, socks, no shoes. He looked like an adult man built for ladders and engines who had been reduced to soft surfaces and approved posture. For one impossible second, neither of us moved. Then I took a step. Gabriel flinched like I had thrown something at him. I stopped immediately. "Okay," I said. "I'm stopping." His eyes went to Miriam, then to Frank, then to the open door behind us, then back to me. Not a free man reading a room, a contained man mapping danger. "How did you get in?" he asked. Frank opened the outer door. No, he said, swallowing hard. I mean, why are you here? There is no clean way to answer that question when the true answer is because I failed to ask it sooner. Ivy told me the truth, I said. He closed his eyes, not in relief, in dread. What exactly did she say? That you aren't in Vermont, that you're here, that when the copper spoon rings, you have to put your face to the wall. He did not deny it. He just looked at the spoon on the desk, and then away from it like a man looking at his own shame after forgetting it had a body. Miriam spoke gently. We aren't here to make this harder, Gabriel. We are here because none of this is right. He gave a short, dead laugh. That depends on which part of the story you think is true. That line told me almost everything. Not because I understood it fully then, because it proved Adrian and Celeste had not merely hidden him. They had built a framework inside him, strong enough that even rescue sounded like a variable. I took another cautious step and lowered myself onto the chair by the wall so I would not be standing over him. You look like your mother when you're angry and trying not to show it, he said. It nearly took me apart, because it meant he still saw enough of the world to compare it to old life, still carried Nora somewhere in him, still recognized me as a man before he fully recognized me as a threat. Your mother saw through people faster than I did, I said. He nodded once. Yes. Then his eyes narrowed with sudden panic. Did Celeste know you were coming? No. Did Adrian know? The panic did not leave. It changed shape. You need to close the outer room, he said. If she comes back and sees the binders moved, there'll be consequences. Consequences. Not trouble, not argument, not questions. Consequences. Frank took that as instruction and quietly reset the outer room to the best of his ability before taking position by the north window. Miriam kept the binders under her arm. I looked at Gabriel and asked the question that mattered most. Why are you here? He answered so fast it sounded rehearsed. Because I'm still in treatment. I let the silence after that do some work. Treatment for what? His jaw set, then released, then said again. You know for what? No, I said. I know what I've been told. I want to hear what you believe. That landed differently. Not accusation, not sympathy, a harder ask. He looked down at his hands. I think I killed Marin. There it was, the axle everything had been turning around. I did not answer right away, because a wrong first response can become a prison of its own. Miriam asked softly, What do you remember? He swallowed. We argued in here about the East Block, about papers I found in Celeste's desk, easement drafts, investor numbers. Marin laughed at me, said I was sentimental and weak, said Dad would die before he understood what the land was really worth. I told her to get out. She shoved me first. I shoved back. She hit the sink. He looked toward the stone counter in the outer room as if he could still see the moment suspended there. There was blood, a lot. She dropped and I thought... He stopped, started again. I thought I'd killed her. Did you check her pulse? Miriam asked. I don't know. Maybe. I tried to lift her. I remember yelling for Celeste. Then Adrian was there. I don't remember him arriving. He said she was gone. He kept saying I had no idea what panic would make me do next if I wasn't controlled fast. The wording hit me immediately. No idea what panic would make me do next. Future hypothetical turned into justification for immediate authority. Then what? I asked. Then Celeste said if this became public, I'd lose Ivy. She said the orchard would be tied to a woman's death and Dad would not survive another scandal after Mom. Adrian said I was already in dissociation. He said intent would not matter if I unraveled in front of police. He said I needed to disappear until they could protect the damage. Protect the damage. Another sentence that sounds almost wise until you hold it under the right light. Gabriel kept going. Words slow at first, then faster. Like he had not been given enough uninterrupted truth in years and did not yet know how to meter it. They took me to Adrian's clinic that night, or office. I don't even know what to call the first place now. I was there for months maybe, long enough that time got weird. They adjusted meds. I signed things. Adrian kept saying I was lucky Celeste was still willing to help me. Lucky Marin's family wanted discretion. Lucky there was still a path back if I cooperated. Then they said the Vermont Lodge could do what local hospitalization couldn't. And after Vermont? He looked up at me fully for the first time. After Vermont, they said I was too fragile to come home but needed familiar environmental anchors. Adrian called this a supervised transition residence. Celeste said Ivy needed to think I was away so she wouldn't carry the burden of me like she carried the burden of Mom. He laughed once, bitter and small. Burden. That word came up a lot. I looked around the room again. The bed, the vent, the notebooks, the drawings, the spoon. Did you agree to come here? Yes, he said immediately, then paused, then corrected himself with obvious effort. I think I did, at first. Or maybe I agreed to something that became this. That was honest enough to break my heart all over again. Captivity does not always begin with a lock. Sometimes it begins with a signature written by a man who believes he deserves punishment more than explanation. What happens if you refuse a rule? Miriam asked. He stared at the floor. That depends. On what? On how public the refusal is, on whether Ivy's involved, on Adrian's mood, on whether Celeste thinks I'm drifting into entitlement. Entitlement. My son sat in a windowed box behind his own house and still used their word for wanting ordinary human contact. What are the rules? I asked. He looked at the spoon, then at the wall beside the door. 1 strike means stop talking and face the wall. 2 means hands visible, sit on the bed. If Celeste opens the outer door and closes it again without coming in, Adrian's with her and wants me settled before he enters. If Adrian says, "How's your tone today?" he thinks I'm resisting. If Celeste says, "Ivy had a full day," there's no contact privilege that week. If I ask big questions after meds, the questions get written down as escalation. I thought I knew anger before that room. I did not. And contact privilege? I said, his mouth twisted. Drawings under the outer door, hearing her in the yard if the window is cracked. Sometimes if I comply long enough, Celeste lets Ivy stand outside the window while the curtain is open for a minute. No touching. No talking unless she approves it. He rubbed his palms against his pants. The idea is that proximity reinforces responsibility. I had to stand up. I could not stay seated and hear that. I turned toward the wall, because if I looked directly at him in that moment, my face would have done what old men's faces do when they realize tenderness has been used as a leash inside their own family. "Gabriel," I said, and my voice came out rawer than I wanted. "Why didn't you ever leave?" He answered from somewhere so tired it felt older than him. "Because leaving only matters if the world outside is cleaner than the one in your head." I turned back. He was not crying. That almost hurt more. Tears at least acknowledged rebellion. He looked like a man who had learned to economize even despair. "I thought if I stayed still enough," he said, "I could keep the damage contained. I thought if I cooperated, Adrian would eventually say the legal risk had faded. I thought if I took the burden instead of spreading it, Ivy would get to grow up somewhere stable. And after a while, this room stopped feeling like captivity and started feeling like the price of not making everything worse. There is no larger prison than believing your own absence is service." Miriam set the binders on the desk and drew 1 sheet from behavior review. She held it out so he could see the language without us touching him or stepping too close. "Gabriel," she said, "does this look like treatment to you?" He read the lines silently. Patient responsive to child-linked incentive. Maintain guilt framing. Wall orientation reducing verbal volatility. His face did not change immediately. Then it changed all at once. Not into certainty, into fracture. "They write like that?" he asked. "Yes." He took the sheet with careful fingers, as though the paper itself might injure him. "This is Adrian's hand," he whispered. I watched him read the words again and understood something horrible and useful. People can live under lies for years if the lies stay emotional. Sometimes the first real crack comes not from pain but from paperwork. "Did you ever see a death certificate for Marin?" Miriam asked. "No." "Any police report?" "No." "Any lawsuit papers? Settlement agreement? Statement you signed under counsel?" "No." "Did you ever see her body removed?" His breathing changed, shallow now, fast. "No." "Did you see Adrian check anything a doctor checks before declaring someone dead?" Long pause, then quietly, "I saw blood." "That's not the same thing," Miriam said. He looked at her with the expression of a man whose mind has been walking one road so long it cannot immediately understand what land exists to the left and right of it. "I saw blood," he repeated. "Yes," she said. "You saw blood. And then you saw 2 people tell you what it meant." I think that was the first real breath of doubt, not hope. Hope comes later, doubt first. Doubt is the splinter that says the coffin might not be nailed shut after all. He looked from Miriam to me. "If you're right," he said, "then why am I still here?" That question matters because it finally turns the gaze outward. Not what did I do? What did they do? I answered honestly, because this room works as long as you believe you belong in it. He stared at the wall a long time after that. Then he said, "If you come back, bring proof." We heard tires on gravel, Celeste. The old training hit him instantly. Shoulders in, jaw tight, eyes to the door. "Go," he whispered. "Please, if she finds you here before I understand what's real, she'll move the story before you can touch it." Frank was already by the side window. Miriam had the binders tucked under her coat. I stepped backward toward the opening, feeling like the worst kind of thief. At the window, I turned once more. "Gabriel?" He looked up. "I am coming back." He held my gaze for 1 long second and said, with more clarity than anything else in that room, "Then come back with something they can't explain." That was the last thing I saw before I climbed out into the cold, crossed the hedge line, and waited in the shadows like a man escaping his own failure. From the north side of the yard, hidden behind the bare maples, I watched Celeste walk into the canning house carrying the evening tray. Same coat, same composed face, same pace. You would have thought she was checking on a sick relative and not maintaining a private moral prison built on guilt, medicine, and my money. There are moments when hatred arrives cleanly. That was one. But hatred was not the useful thing yet. Proof was. The next 48 hours felt less like living and more like sorting apples after hail. Bruised ones one side, good fruit the other. You move fast because rot is honest once it starts, and if you hesitate too long, everything spreads. Miriam and I began with the only question big enough to support all the rest. Was Maren Bell actually dead? You would think that would be easy to answer. You would be wrong. People assume the truth about a body lives in one file somewhere, waiting politely for the right name. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it lives in delayed filings, out-of-county records, civil traces, travel data, property histories, and the arrogance of people who think no one grieving enough will ever bother to connect them. Miriam worked phones. I worked memory. What did Maren wear the night of the fight? Who did she know? What companies had she mentioned at dinner? What little vanity projects had she floated while pretending to unlock emotional value in our acreage? What city licenses or boards would a woman like that have touched? Who had photographed events she attended? Which hotel she bragged about when she visited in harvest season? What kind of car she drove? What scar she had on her wrist from grabbing a hot jam pot as a teenager during one summer at the orchard? I remembered that last detail because Nora scolded her for reaching bare-handed over steam, and Maren laughed like consequences were charming. Miriam wrote everything down. By late afternoon, she had a list of likely business aliases and event networks. Branding consultant, experience curator, hospitality transition advisor. If there is one thing modern greed understands better than shame, it is wording. At 6 that evening, she called and said, "Come over." I drove to her office in town with my coat half buttoned and my head full of copper spoon and sealed window, and Gabriel's face when he read Adrian's notes. Miriam had 3 pages on her desk and 1 photo open on the screen. The photo had been pulled from a small lakeshore development newsletter, the kind realtors and boutique investors send around to one another so they can pretend greed is community. Bad white wine, tiny cheese plate, people smiling too hard beside some new luxury renovation. Third from the left stood Maren Bell, alive, longer hair, blonder than before, but alive, cream coat, one hand on a glass. The burn scar just visible on her left wrist because she had pushed her sleeve back while laughing at something the man beside her had said. Alive. I sat down without meaning to. "You're sure?" I asked. Miriam did not waste emotion on the question. "Yes." The room went very quiet. That should have been relief first. It was not. It was humiliation, then rage, then something worse than both. Because if Maren was alive, my son had spent nearly 4 years inside that room carrying a death that never happened. And I had not merely failed to rescue him, I had subsidized the architecture of the lie. Miriam kept going because she understands timing better than sympathy. The event newsletter linked to a hospitality investment group. The group linked to a condo association board mention. The condo linked, through mailing data and a management LLC, to Vail Behavioral Stewardship's secondary corporate nest, same nest that had received one of my temporary processing transfers. Then came the property record, Lake Michigan, 2-bedroom condo, purchased just under 3 years ago, title held through Harbor Lantern Holdings, an LLC with a registered agent stupid enough to reuse an email tied to Adrian Vail's clinic administrator. "And Maren lives there?" I asked. "Not formally, not in her own name, but she appears in association event photos across 18 months, and the mailing activity lines up too neatly to be coincidence." That was when I asked the question I had been avoiding because the answer was going to make everything uglier. "How much of my money bought that place?" Miriam folded her hands. "Directly? Hard to say yet. Indirectly? Enough. Enough. Such a simple word. Such an awful one. We pulled more threads, then more. A dissolved event company. A hospitality retreat proposal. Vendor reimbursements tied to Harbor Lantern. A set of consulting payments from one shell to another. And underneath it all, the same pattern. My transfers from harvest season moving into care accounts, then administrative accounts, then sideways into lifestyle. Not survival, not treatment, conversion. That night I did not go home right away. I drove to the lakeshore development and sat outside the condo with the engine off. The building looked like every expensive compromise Americans make with guilt once they have enough money to package it well. Clean siding, tasteful lights, low landscaping, a balcony pretending to mean something. The sort of place people buy when they want distance from consequence but still need good water views for photographs. At 7:42, a woman came out carrying a tote bag and laughing into her phone. Maren. No blood, no ghost, no burial. No silence except the kind that comes from weather and money and distance from the place where your lie is still working. She crossed the lot slowly, opened the back of an SUV, and took out a bundle of rolled decor samples, candles, fabric swatches, some stupid wedding board. That detail might seem small. It mattered to me because it told the whole story in one image. While my son sat behind a sealed window believing he had killed a woman, that woman had gone on arranging centerpieces. There are some truths so indecent they become clarifying. At 8:17, Adrian arrived. He did not look furtive. That bothered me almost more than anything. He parked, checked nothing, and went straight to the same door, like a man walking into his own second life. Marin opened before he knocked. He stepped inside. That is when hatred became useful. Not because it made me brave, because it stripped the last of my nostalgia out of the problem. I no longer cared whether there was some misunderstood therapeutic logic somewhere inside this arrangement. There was not. There was greed. There was coercion. There was a doctor splitting evenings between a captive patient behind one family house and the allegedly dead woman in a lakeside condo, financed through care money. By the time I got home, Miriam had brought in Dennis Schaefer. Dennis was a forensic accountant whose shirts never fit his neck right, and whose soul seemed to have been sharpened against fraud for so long that normal conversation no longer interested him unless numbers were bleeding through it. He met us the next morning in a conference room above a title office and asked for every transfer I had ever made under Celeste's instructions. He built the timeline on a whiteboard: harvest transfer, administrative routing, oversight fee, temporary support adjustment, LLC movement, property acquisition, consulting reimbursement, condo improvement expense, travel, retainer, round trip. Step by step, the money stopped pretending to be care. At one point, Dennis put down the marker, stepped back, and said, "This is not random leakage. This is design." "What kind of design?" I asked. "The kind people build when they realize sorrow arrives on schedule." That sentence hit me hard because it was exactly right. Every fall, after the orchard closed to tourists and the books came due, I became the same man in the same chair. Easier to reach, easier to shame, easier to invoice. Sorrow arrives on schedule. So does harvest. So does greed, if it is patient enough. Dennis found the key correlation just before lunch. My largest annual transfer from year 2 hit the administrative shell. 10 days later, Harbor Lantern wired closing funds. 3 weeks after that, Marin began appearing in event listings near the lake. The next fall, another transfer from me coincided with furnishing expenses. The year after that, yet another lined up with a debt reduction payment on the condo. "You financed their arrangement," Dennis said bluntly. I laughed once, no humor in it. "Yes," I said, "I'm catching up." He did not apologize. Good, there was nothing to apologize with. By mid-afternoon, we had something even worse. A draft petition, not filed, prepared, permanent supported decision structure for Gabriel Rowan under physician affidavit. That was the title. Inside were familiar phrases dressed in more final clothing: chronic guilt destabilization, reduced independent judgment, persistent child-linked volatility, need for controlled family interface, recommended durable financial supervision, property decision support, parental contact modulation. They were not merely keeping him there. They were moving toward legal permanence. Harvest him long enough, then formalize the orchard. That draft named Adrian as recommended clinical authority and Celeste as proposed daily decision proxy. I stared at the page so long the words stopped looking like language and started looking like frost crystals eating the edges of a field. "What would this have given them?" I asked. Miriam answered. "Access to his share, capacity leverage, parental narrative advantage, easement cooperation, probably enough structure to push the East acreage through if they could convince a court he was too unstable to refuse." There it was, the land, always the land, not the whole motive. Greed rarely limits itself to one appetite, but enough motive to keep the machinery lubricated. Get my money, get Gabriel's compliance, get Ivy as leverage. Then get the East Block sold to developers with the captive husband described as too fragile to know what was best for him. If you want to know what revenge felt like in that moment, it was not hot. It was cold and agricultural. Pruning. You do not scream at blight. You cut it out, low, clean, before it reaches the rest of the rootstock. That evening I went back to the canning house with Miriam's folder under my coat and Marin's event photo in a stiff envelope. Same hedge line, same cold, same ugly little spoon hanging on the nail. I knocked once at the side window because Gabriel had told me he listened for irregular sounds when Celeste and Adrian were out. 3 taps, pause, 1 tap. The pattern we had agreed on through a note Miriam tucked under the outer door earlier that day. He opened within seconds. That alone told me doubt was already moving. A man who believes his confinement is medicinal waits. A man who suspects it is not begins listening for the world differently. Inside, he looked no healthier, but he looked more awake. "I didn't think you'd come this fast," he said. "That part of me still works." He almost smiled. Almost. I laid the envelope on the desk. "This is the first thing," I said. "There's more after." His fingers hovered over the photo before lifting it. He stared, then his face went blank, then too full, then blank again. That's old, he said. It's 10 months old. No, there's a date on the newsletter print. He read the date, read it again, then touched the left edge of the photo where Marin's sleeve had ridden up. The scar, he whispered. Yes. He sat very still. I remember that scar, he said. Nora wrapped it in gauze with blueberry cartoon bears because she said hospital tape scares children and some adults never recover. He looked up at me. If this is real, then what happened that night? That, I said carefully, is the right question. I showed him the condo record, then the LLC nesting, then the unfiled supported decision draft, then the transfer timeline. Dennis had simplified into one clean page so the story of the money could not hide inside jargon. Gabriel read in silence. At the draft petition, his jaw clenched. At the money timeline, his breathing changed. At the condo record, he looked genuinely nauseated. Then he whispered, they were never going to let me out. It is one thing to think that, another to say it. The moment a captive person names the structure begins to lose oxygen. We talked for nearly an hour that night, about Marin, about the fight, about what he remembered clearly and what he now distrusted. The best detail he gave us was also the simplest. Marin smiled wrong, he said. What does that mean? I asked. She was too calm while pushing, like she wanted me mad, not gone. She kept saying the same kind of thing over and over, about Mom being dead and you being tired and the orchard needing people with actual nerve. She kept glancing at the back door like she expected someone. Adrian, I said. Maybe, or Celeste. I don't remember who came in first anymore. That part's broken. Broken memory is one of the cruelest tools because the captive starts apologizing for the exact places the liar did the most damage. Did you ever see Marin's body leave? I asked. No. Did anyone besides Adrian declare her dead? No. Did you ever sign a police statement? No. Any settlement? No. He leaned back against the wall and laughed once quietly. I spent almost 4 years in a room because I believed one man in a wool coat speaking in a calm voice. No, I said. You spent 4 years in a room because 3 people understood shock better than decency. He closed his eyes. And Ivy? Yes. He opened them again and asked the question that finally turned the last screw. How much money did he take from you? I answered honestly. 200 and something thousand by now, once the extras and routing shifts are counted. He went white. For me? For the story built around you. That distinction mattered. I could see him hearing it, not because it absolved him, because it repositioned him from cost center to target. Then he said, if we go to police now, they'll say I agreed to treatment. Maybe, I said, which is why we do not go with heartbreak. We go with structure. He looked at the binders Miriam had copied, then at the petition draft, then at the photo of Marin alive. What do you need from me? That was the first active sentence he had offered about his own release, and that was when I knew the next phase could begin. What I needed from Gabriel was not heroism. That was important. Men raised the way I was raised make dangerous mistakes around heroism. We treat it like a universal solvent. We think courage can dissolve every practical problem if we pour enough of it on. It cannot. What I needed from him was steadiness under manipulation. And that is a different animal entirely. By then, Miriam had already placed the outline of the case in Detective Neil Carver's hands. Carver did not work out of the local sheriff's office, where Celeste still knew enough church ladies to manufacture sympathy by instinct. He was with the county's Financial Crimes and Vulnerable Exploitation Task Group, a title long enough to sound bureaucratic until you need it very badly. He met us after hours in a side office off the county annex. Broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, tie loosened, face with almost no extra expression on it. He listened to the whole story without once doing the thing bad listeners do, which is interrupt you with their own reaction, so you have to carry both the facts and their feelings at the same time. When I finished, he asked only 4 questions. Is the allegedly dead woman verifiably alive? Yes. Do you have evidence the treatment payments were diverted? Yes. Is there written material indicating coercive control rather than ordinary therapeutic structure? Yes. And is your son willing to participate before they know the case is moving? That was the hinge, the only answer that mattered yet. Yes, I said. But he doesn't know how to hold himself outside their script for long. Carver nodded. Then he said the sentence that turned our kitchen horror into a legal direction. Then you do not have a family misunderstanding. You have fraud, coercion, unlawful confinement questions, exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and a child used as leverage. The rest is evidence management. Evidence management. That phrase calmed me more than any kindness could have. Not because it softened anything, because it gave the problem edges. Carver brought in Assistant Prosecutor Leah Sutter the next morning. Leah was in her early 40s, spare, focused, and had the unnerving habit of seeing the structure of a thing before you had finished describing its surface. She specialized in coercive control and caregiver exploitation cases. I did not know such a specialization existed. I wish I had known sooner. She went through our files and said something I have repeated to myself many times since. People understand cages best when they can see bars. Your job is to show the bars are emotional, financial, medical, and parental all at once. That was exactly right, because the canning house alone was not the whole prison. The prison was the spoon, the notes, the drugs, the child window privilege, the annual money, the threat of public ruin, the lie about Marin, the gradual replacement of Gabriel's inner voice with Adrian's language. A sealed room helps, but the real bars had been built in layers. We met Gabriel in a neutral interview room, 2 towns over, through a transport arrangement Carver described as temporary witness consultation. That was a fancy term for getting a grown man out of his family's cage without triggering the cage keepers too early. The first time Gabriel stepped into that room, he stopped just inside the door and looked at the chairs like they were part of a test. Leah noticed immediately. "Do you want the wall behind you or the door in view?" she asked. He looked at her, then at the room, then at the chair nearest the wall. "The wall. Good," she said. "Take the wall." No performance, no pity, just control returned in small, clean pieces. That first session was not about confession or confrontation. It was about rhythm. What happens when Celeste feels uncertainty? What phrases Adrian uses when he wants obedience without shouting? What kinds of questions make Gabriel start apologizing before he has even answered? What words mean danger? What words mean fake safety? What causes medication changes? How child access gets dangled? How silence is extracted? He told us everything. If Celeste says you're slipping again, she means I'm thinking independently. If Adrian says your tone is getting expensive, he means I'm forcing him to spend more effort managing me. If Celeste says Ivy had questions, I'm supposed to feel guilty before I ask what they were. If Adrian says, "We're protecting you from aftermath," he wants me to stop requesting specifics. If the spoon rings once, no talking. Twice, bed edge and hands visible. If Celeste uses my full name, she's angry. If Adrian suddenly gets soft, he's about to threaten loss of child contact. Leah wrote everything down. Then she started doing something I did not expect. She made Gabriel answer those phrases differently. Not in some shiny cinematic way. No speeches. No sharp one-liners that only exist because writers think suffering becomes eloquent right when it is most exhausted. Just differently. When Celeste says, "You're slipping again," what is the real question under it? Whether I'm under control. Good. Then answer that, not the line. When Adrian says, "Your tone is getting expensive," what is the real claim? That my independence is inconvenient. Good. Answer that. At first, Gabriel could not do it. The old structure was too fast. He shrank before the mock phrase was halfway out, apologized before being accused, explained before being asked. Leah stopped each time. "No, that response belongs to the old house," she said. "We are building a different one." That sentence stayed with me. We are building a different house. For men like me, houses mean things, not just shelter, order, load, memory, permission, what weight can be carried and what must never be placed on the beam. So we built, question by question, response by response. Breathe first, delay second. Answer the motive underneath the phrase, not the phrase itself. Do not rush to fill silence. Make them explain, make them justify. People who rely on authority often confess most cleanly when their authority slips, and they start resenting the work of maintaining it. Carver brought in Aaron Pike for the technical side. Younger than I expected, soft voice, tired eyes, hands that handled wires and transmitters with the kind of care priests ought to give communion. He laid out the options: microphone under shirt seam, secondary pickup near collar, live feed to the vehicle, backup recorder in case of signal loss, timestamps, reserve units staged nearby, emergency entry if physical harm began or evidence destruction started. Listening to him explain recording equipment while my son sat in a county office drinking actual coffee from a paper cup made the whole thing feel briefly unreal. Like I had wandered into some procedural television world where betrayal comes with technicians and neat terminology. Then Leah asked the question that brought it all back. Can he hold the line under direct pressure? Silence. Because willingness is not the same thing as capacity. Not after 4 years. Gabriel looked at his coffee, then at the wall, then said, "I don't know." That was the bravest answer in the room. So we trained. The first day nearly broke all of us. Leah played Celeste, not with mockery, with precision. "Gabriel, your tone is already slipping and Ivy had a hard morning because of it." He froze. Actually froze. Shoulders high, breath gone, eyes unfocused. I started to stand. Carver shook his head once. Leah stayed with him. "What year is it?" she asked. He swallowed. "This year." "Whose room are you in?" "County office." "Who controls the door?" "You do." "Who decides whether you see Ivy right now?" He did not answer. "Gabriel, who decides whether you see Ivy right now?" "No one in this room." Again, "No one in this room." By the third repetition, air came back into him. That was when I understood the deepest layer of what Adrian and Celeste had done. Not only narrative control, not only physical control, they had gotten into his body, his reflexes, his lungs. One sentence could still take his breath away. That is not treatment. That is installation. The next exercise was Adrian. Carver used the voice because he could mimic that calm male certainty without turning it into theater. "Gabriel," he said, "you are confusing emotional activation with clarity." The first time, my son bowed his head automatically. Leah stopped the exercise. "What is he really saying?" Gabriel rubbed his forehead. "That my understanding only counts if he approves it." "Good. Answer that." Again. "Gabriel, you are confusing emotional activation with clarity." This time, Gabriel looked up and said, shaky but audible, "No, I'm separating your language from what happened to me." Leah did not smile. She nodded once. Again. By the fifth repetition, the line sounded like his. Dry, tired, real. Not something borrowed from a lawyer or a movie. That mattered. The answer has to fit the person, or pressure will shake it loose too fast. We built the confrontation in steps. Step 1. Gabriel tells them he knows enough to stop performing agreement. Step 2. He does not reveal immediately how much he knows. Step 3. He asks the central questions in order of emotional force and evidentiary value. Was Marin ever dead? Was I ever really dangerous to Ivy? How much money was taken in my name? Why the petition? How long were you planning to keep me here? Were you ever going to let me back into my own life? Step 4. He does not chase every lie. He stays with the fact under it. If Adrian reframes, return to the original question. If Celeste guilt loads, return to the fact. If either threatens child access, note the threat and return. Step 5. If physical escalation begins or if they start moving him, he uses the line. The code phrase mattered. It had to sound natural. Natural enough that they would not hear it as a signal. Specific enough that Aaron and Carver's team would know the line had been crossed. We tested options. Ivy needs better than this. Possible, but too broad. Stop using Ivy. Too direct. You never loved Ivy, only control. Too dramatic and not his voice. Then Gabriel, staring at the paper cup in his hands, said quietly, "What about this?" He looked up and said, "If you really cared about Ivy, you would stop." The room went still. There it was. Not theatrical, not borrowed. Sharp, natural, and believable in his mouth. If you really cared about Ivy, you would stop. Aaron ran the audio test. Clear, distinct, no chance of accidental duplication unless the conversation had already reached the exact zone where we wanted intervention anyway. That became the line. The next sessions got better. Not easy, never easy, better. At one point, with Leah playing Celeste, she said, "You should be thanking me. Without me, you would be in prison and your daughter would grow up visiting a broken man." Gabriel answered, "You don't get to call this help just because you arranged it neatly." That one made Leah write something on her pad and circle it. Another time, Carver, using Adrian's calm voice, said, "I contained the damage you created." Gabriel answered, "No, you found damage and turned it into a business." That one mattered too, because it named the financial spine beneath the emotional rhetoric. Still, there were setbacks. One afternoon, Leah deliberately pushed the wrong spot to see how bad it still was. She said softly, "If you make this ugly now, Ivy will remember you as the reason the house broke." Gabriel stood so fast the chair tipped, not toward violence, toward collapse. He was shaking so hard the tabletop rattled under his hands. I moved before I could stop myself. Carver caught my arm. "Wait." Leah did not back away. She grounded him again. Year, room, door. Who controls what? Whose words are these? Which voice is speaking now? It took 12 minutes. 12 minutes for one sentence to stop governing his body. That night I drove the long route home because if I had taken the short one, I might have ended up at the lake condo with a tire iron and a ruined future. Rage is easy. Useful revenge is slower. That is the hardest thing I learned in all this. You can want to tear blight out by hand. If you do it recklessly, you damage the good wood too. The final planning meeting took place in Miriam's office above the square. Rain tapping the windows. Dennis's money charts on one wall. Aaron's equipment on the table. Carver and Leah side by side with the kind of quiet focus that makes you grateful there are still adults somewhere in the world. The plan was simple in outline and dangerous in execution. Celeste believed two things. First, that I was still slower than she was because grief and age and routine had made me manipulable. Second, that Gabriel's emerging resistance meant she and Adrian needed to speed the legal structure up before spring. So we gave them bait. Miriam, from a number Celeste did not know, leaked that I had finally agreed to discuss East Acreage sale terms and Gabriel's permanent supported decision package before the new tax quarter. Dennis arranged the financial pretext, a developer draft, a tax issue, a timing pressure that made hesitation costly. Then I sent the text myself. We need to end uncertainty around Gabriel and the East Block. Tomorrow. Canning house first, then office. Bring Adrian. If we are formalizing this, we do it cleanly. Greed hates delay more than it fears risk. Celeste answered in under 3 minutes. Agreed. Adrian says clarity will be good for everyone. Not for everyone, as it turned out, but for us, yes. That night, Aaron fitted Gabriel for the wire in Miriam's back office. Small transmitter under the shirt seam, secondary microphone in the collar fold, backup patch near the spine. Nothing dramatic. Just enough clean signal to carry truth out of a building where it had been starved for years. Before we left, Gabriel stood by the door and asked me a question I had been dreading for some time. If they admit everything, he said, what happens to me? No one rushed in. No one gave him a movie answer. Leah was honest. It depends on the evidence around the original incident, the deception, the drugging, the control structure, and whether we can show you were manipulated under false premises. We are not promising a clean emotional ending tomorrow. We are promising that the lie stops getting to define the facts. He nodded slowly. That was enough, not because it soothed him, because he accepted truth over comfort. Then he asked me one more thing. If I had done it, he said, if Marin had really died from that shove, would you still have come? I answered without thinking, because some truths do not need practice. Yes, he held my gaze. Would you still stay? Yes, he looked away fast. Not because he doubted me, because he believed me, and did not yet know what to do with that. Manipulators make love conditional because unconditional love ruins leverage. That was the last thing I said to him before Operation Morning. You are not staying in that room another night because they say you deserve it. He nodded once. No speech, no tears, just a nod. Sometimes that is what rebuilding starts with. Not hope, not forgiveness, a nod. The morning of the confrontation arrived gray and wet, the kind of March day Michigan uses to remind you that spring is a rumor until proven otherwise. I went out to the orchard at dawn and walked the lower rows without gloves because I needed the cold to make decisions feel less like memory and more like something still happening under my own skin. The trees were bare, pruned, waiting. At the East Block, where Celeste had wanted cabins and lantern weddings and soft-lit nonsense for people willing to pay 3 times normal prices to pretend nature had curated itself for them, the ground held last year's leaves in slick brown drifts. Land does not care what story people tell over it. It remembers shovel, root, frost, blood. That steadied me. By 9, everyone was in place. Carver had 2 unmarked vehicles a half block away and 1 utility van staged on the service lane near the cider building. Leah was in the rear office with Aaron, listening to the live feed and marking time. Miriam sat with Dennis in the upstairs conference room because the second phase of the plan required papers, not just handcuffs. Frank, though not officially part of anything by then, had volunteered to watch the north fence in case Celeste or Adrian tried to route somebody out through the orchard. I stayed where I could hear, but not contaminate the opening. The old tasting office off the pressing room, window cracked, legal documents spread before me so the second scene would look exactly like what they expected if they made it that far. Gabriel entered the canning house at 10:23 under his own power. That mattered. Not because appearance was everything, because in systems like this, the first act of defiance is often walking into the room as a participant rather than being delivered to it as a patient. Aaron checked the audio, clear. Then all that was left was waiting. At 10:31, Celeste arrived. No Ivy in the car. That told us she understood the meeting as strategic, not domestic. She wore a navy coat, low boots, and the expression of a woman who had already decided the emotional range the day required. Measured concern first, professional frustration second, hard authority only if needed. Adrian came 4 minutes later. Gray overcoat, black umbrella, leather folder under one arm, not rushing. Why would he rush? As far as he knew, he was still walking into a structure he had engineered and maintained for years. They entered the canning house together, the outer door shut, coat buttons, umbrella shake, chair scrape. Then Celeste's voice. You're sitting in the wrong room. Not hello, not are you okay, not how are you feeling. The wrong room. In coercive systems, place is language. Gabriel answered calmly. Maybe I got tired of the right one. Silence. It was the first live pause, and it felt enormous because I knew how much work that tone had cost him. Celeste tried first, soft concern, the silk glove. Gabriel, if this is because you're anxious about today, we can slow down. Adrian and I are here to prevent you from spiraling. I could almost see Leah writing in the office. Gabriel did not apologize. This is me being done with spiraling on command. Another pause. Then Adrian entered the line of sight, or the sound shifted as if he had moved closer. Language like that tells me your tone is already destabilized, he said. The voice, still calm, still curated, still expensive. My hands closed on the edge of the desk in the tasting office. Gabriel answered, exactly as trained, but somehow still sounding fully like himself. No, it tells you I'm not doing what you expected. Nothing. Not for nearly 3 seconds. Then Adrian asked the question all managers of control ask when control speaks back. Who have you been talking to? Gabriel let the silence sit, then said, How long have you known Marin was alive? I heard Celeste inhale sharply. Not enough to be a gasp. Enough. Adrian answered first because men like him always think language can still outpace reality if they get there early enough. Gabriel, you are not in a condition to throw names around based on fragments. Fragments. Good, not false, not impossible. Not what are you talking about. Fragments. Gabriel stayed with it. How long have you known Marin was alive? Celeste cut in. Where did you get that idea? Again, no denial, only source management. I'm asking you, Gabriel said. You're agitated, Celeste snapped, the first edge coming through. This is exactly what happens when boundaries get breached too fast. Boundaries. Another word trying to launder ownership. What boundaries? Gabriel asked quietly. The ones between my daughter and the window, or the ones between your bank account and the money Dad thought he was paying for treatment. That hit them. I could hear it. Not because either cried out, because the room changed frequency the way a press changes sound when a belt slips. Adrian moved back to authority. Let's reset, he said. You are clearly flooded, and flooded minds manufacture coherence where there is only emotional debris. That line made Aaron mutter something obscene in the next room. Faint through the crackle of the headset feed, Gabriel answered, No, flooded minds are what you needed. Clear ones ask for dates. Good, very good. Then he began the sequence. Was Marin ever dead? Silence. Answer me, Adrian said more quietly now. The event with Marin was medically and psychologically complex. Not dead, not gone. Complex. Gabriel stayed on the rail. Was she ever dead? Celeste laughed then, a short, ugly sound I had never heard from her in public. Not because it was loud, because it carried contempt without bothering to disguise it. This is why we controlled contact, she said. You always make everything stupid once you think you've found one loose thread. There, the contempt. The thing control always carries underneath its concern. Gabriel asked again. One sentence, one fact, one bar in the cage. Was Marin ever dead? This time Adrian answered. No, just that. No. Not dead, not gone, not tragic, not lost, no. My son had spent almost 4 years under a guilt sentence built on a one-syllable lie. The air in the tasting office went thin. For one insane second, I thought my own knees might fail before theirs did. Through the feed, Gabriel's next breath sounded like something tearing. Then he asked the second central question. Was I ever really dangerous to Ivy? This time Celeste answered too fast. You were unstable. That's not the question. You were impossible, Gabriel. Was I dangerous to my daughter? Adrian tried to smooth it. Danger is not binary. Gabriel did not let him. Was I dangerous to Ivy? The pause this time lasted longer because they were recalculating, not the truth, the damage. Finally, Adrian said with the weariness of a man irritated that reality requires plain speech. Not in the way we described it, no. There it was. Not in the way we described it. Meaning, yes, they had described it. No, it was not true. Yes, they knew the description did the work they needed. Gabriel did not cry. He laughed once, hollow and astonished. So what was I then? Celeste answered in a voice stripped nearly clean of performance. A liability. The word sat in the room like a nail driven through green wood. Not husband, not father, not grieving man, not patient. Liability. I knew then that whatever part of Celeste still cared whether her soul could be recognized from the outside had left years earlier. Gabriel asked, quieter now, which somehow made it more terrible. A liability to what? Celeste did not hesitate. To everything, to the orchard, to Ivy, to money, to my life, to momentum. You could not make a decision without drowning in it. You could not lose your mother without turning every room into a memorial. You could not go 1 week without asking if you were poisoning your own child just by being sad in the house. Her breathing had gone harder, the mask slipping by degrees. Do you know what it is like living beside someone who makes guilt the center of gravity? I got tired of falling into you. There are honest grievances. Then there are honest grievances used to justify evil. Maybe Gabriel had been drowning after Nora died. Maybe he had been heavy to live with. Maybe Celeste had suffered beside him. None of that builds a legal or moral bridge to a locked room and a child used as a reward. Gabriel kept the line. So you put me here. We contained what was already destroying everyone. That was Adrian. Clinical again. Dry. The voice of a man trying to drag the moment back under professional shade. You put me in a room and rang a spoon to make me face the wall. Because ordinary verbal redirection stopped working. That one mattered enormously. Not because it was flashy, because it was specific. An admitted tool. A method. Not an accident. I saw Carver straighten through the office window. He held one finger up. Not yet. Gabriel moved to the money. How much did you take from Dad? No answer. How much? Adrian said. Financial support was necessary for a complex continuity environment. The phrase continuity environment nearly made me lunge out of the office. Gabriel answered first. You mean the condo on the lake? The room went dead. Then Celeste said very quietly, I told you the papers would make him dramatic. The papers. Not fake, not forged, not misunderstood. The papers, Gabriel went on. Marin alive, Adrian visiting, Harbor Lantern, Vale Behavioral, the petition, the East Block, my share. He let the words fall one at a time, like tools set on a table before repair. How long were you going to keep me here? Adrian tried one more deflection. The supported structure was meant to transition with your stability. That's not an answer. It was contingent. On what? This time the silence said it before either of them did. On never. Celeste finally snapped. On you becoming usable. The line landed like an axe. She must have heard it too, because she tried to pull back instantly, but anger had already outrun management. You think you get to judge this now? She said. You sat in that room because you were easier there. Because guilt finally made you cooperative. Because every time life asked anything from you, you turned into grief and paperwork and hesitation. Marin's accident gave Adrian a path, yes. And I took it because I was not going to watch the orchard rot while you worshipped your own damage. Worshipped your own damage. Even evil gets bored and starts telling the truth in its own voice if you leave it unchallenged long enough. Gabriel asked the final land question. And the East Block. Celeste laughed without humor. Of course the East Block. Do you know what that property would clear if somebody with nerve handled it? Do you know what Dad would have signed after a few more bad seasons if you were not still attached to everything by sentiment and legal nuisance? Legal nuisance. That is what my son had become in her mouth. Not a man with ownership. Nuisance. Adrian moved again, perhaps realizing she had gone too far and perhaps too late. We are losing focus, he said. Gabriel, you need to understand that after Marin, the primary objective was harm minimization. Then it became legacy preservation. Legacy preservation. The medical euphemism for theft had just married the financial euphemism for erasure. Gabriel said, no, it became a business. Adrian answered with the first real impatience in his voice. Yes, because damage costs money, because private discretion costs money, because your father's sentimentality cost money, because your confinement, medication, environmental management, and instability all required labor. He exhaled sharply. You call it a business as if that makes it automatically false. It made it sustainable. There was the spine, not help, sustainability, profit logic admitted, care redefined as an operating model. Carver lifted his hand halfway. Leah, visible through the glass now, shook her head once. Still more, the petition, the child leverage, the physical system. Gabriel moved where we had hoped he would. What about Ivy? He said. Why use her? No one answered immediately. Then Celeste said, almost bored now that contempt had gotten moving. Because she worked. Not because she needed protection. Not because therapists recommended distance. Not because contact was delicate. Because she worked. I have never heard anything uglier in a calmer voice. Gabriel's next words came thin but steady. You let her think I was sick and dangerous because she worked. You were sick, Celeste snapped. I was controlled. You were unbearable. By you. That did it. Movement exploded in the room. Chair slam, fabric rush, a body closing distance too fast. Through the feed I heard Celeste say, teeth clenched, do not rewrite me after everything I saved you from. Then Gabriel, louder now, the line breaking cleanly through all of it. If you really cared about Ivy, you would stop. Carver moved before the final word had finished leaving Aaron's speakers. The entry itself lasted seconds. The preparation behind it had taken days. That is how useful justice often looks from the outside. Sudden, as if the truth simply burst through a door because it had finally grown tired of waiting. It does not happen that way. It happens because enough patient people gather enough plain facts that the door loses its right to stay shut. The outer office door flew open first, then the Canning House service entrance. Carver and two deputies came through one side while Leah and a county investigator entered behind them. Aaron stayed on audio. Miriam and I reached the threshold half a breath later, held back just long enough not to contaminate the first contact. Celeste had Gabriel by the front of his shirt, not striking him, worse in a way, possessing him. Her face was close to his, fury finally free of all the careful table manners she had worn for years. Adrian stood half-turned toward the back partition where the notebooks were kept, clearly deciding whether his first instinct should be to help her, talk, or destroy paper. Carver solved the question for him. Hands visible now, he said, voice flat as a splitting wedge. Back away from Mr. Rowan and step clear of that shelf. Adrian froze. The cool doctor face almost returned. Almost. Then the deputies were on them, one separating Celeste from Gabriel, one moving Adrian away from the partition. Leah heading straight for the desk, the spoon, the binders, the medication tray, every small physical bar the room had been built from. I went to my son because fathers in stories always say they do not know what they are going to do in that moment. But I did know. I was going to make sure no one else touched him first. Gabriel, I said, He was shaking so hard his teeth clicked once when he breathed in, but he did not collapse, did not apologize, did not ask permission to stand. He looked at the room full of badges and paper and witnesses and said, with a kind of exhausted wonder, "They actually sounded worse out loud." That almost broke me, because yes, that is one of the final humiliations of manipulation. Once the private language gets dragged into ordinary air, it often sounds exactly as monstrous as it always was. Celeste began protesting immediately. "This is outrageous. He is in active psychiatric distress. Adrian has authority here. This is an assault on a treatment environment. Elias, tell them he is not safe outside structure." Outside structure. Even then, even with deputies at her elbows and the spoon on the desk like a metal confession, she still spoke as if the problem was disorder, not cruelty. I turned to look at her. There are moments when you discover hatred can make your voice cleaner than anger ever could. That happened to me there. "You used my granddaughter as a leash," I said. "You used my son as a funding model. You used my wife's death as timing. You used my grief as a billing cycle. Do not ever ask me to help you name this room again." Her face changed, not into remorse, into calculation failing under too much light. Adrian tried a different strategy, professional offense. "Detective, you are making a serious error. This patient is impaired. The recordings were obtained during psychological destabilization. You have no context for years of treatment compliance, crisis de-escalation, or the acute harm prevention burdens we've carried." Leah held up one of the binders. "Does acute harm prevention usually include child-linked incentive schedules, wall orientation cues, and financial proxy petitions tied to undeclared shell entities?" Adrian shut his mouth. Not because he had run out of words, because he had run out of the kind that could still pass as medicine. The Canning house changed fast after that. Pictures, evidence bags, photographs of the spoon on the desk, photographs of the exterior nail, photographs of the outer window latches, the sealed inner pane, the digital lock, the notebooks, the medication caddies, the underside of the desk where one of the old notes from Ivy had slipped between slats and stayed hidden. Leah asked me not to touch anything. I obeyed, not because I liked it, because by then I finally understood the difference between loving the truth and helping it survive court. Gabriel sat on the chair by the wall while a trauma specialist from the county asked him questions in a voice designed not to echo Adrian's. Name, date, would he like water? Did he understand who was in the room? Did he want the blanket? Did he want to keep the door open? Did he want me near? He said yes to me. That felt larger than the sirens I had not heard years earlier. In the middle of all that, Ivy came home. I heard the car first, then the side door, then her voice in the yard, asking why there were strange cars by the orchard. Some tragedies are very loud. Some arrive on a 9-year-old's voice calling for her mother. Miriam moved before anyone else did. She met Ivy at the path with one of the deputies, and the child response worker, Carver, had staged for exactly this possibility. From where I stood, I could not hear every word. I saw enough. Ivy looking beyond Miriam toward the Canning house. Ivy recognizing uniforms. Ivy searching faces and not finding a safe adult where she expected one. Then Miriam kneeling so her eyes were level and saying something steady enough that Ivy's shoulders dropped half an inch. When the trauma worker asked Gabriel whether he wanted immediate contact with his daughter or whether that needed a slower hand, he cried for the first time. Not dramatically, not all at once. His mouth just folded wrong, and his eyes filled, and he pressed both palms over them like a man trying to keep the inside from leaving too fast. "I don't want her to think she did something wrong by telling," he said. "That sentence tells you everything worth knowing about fatherhood and everything worth hating about what had been done to him." Leah nodded, then turned to me. "She should hear first from him that the truth helped," she said, "not that it broke the house." So we did it carefully. No cinematic rush, no child sprinting into arms while detectives cheered in the background. Reality is kinder and crueler than that. Ivy stood at the edge of the yard under the old pear tree in her school coat with one sleeve half turned inside out because she had probably dressed in a hurry that morning. Miriam stood beside her, the child response worker on the other side, the wind carrying a little rain off the east row. Gabriel stepped out of the Canning house slowly, not because anyone forced him to, because he was relearning what leaving looked like. He stopped at the path as if the line between concrete and grass needed its own permission. I went with him until we were 10 feet from Ivy. Then I stopped. He did not open his arms. That was the right instinct. Children who have lived around fear do not need adults making emotional demands look like generosity. He just said, "Hi, Bean." Ivy stared at him for 2 full seconds, then 3. Then she walked forward, not running, not yet. Slowly first, because children know when a moment is real and deserve time to test it with their own feet. When she reached him, she touched his sleeve before she touched him, as if confirming texture. Then she said, in a small torn voice, "You're outside. He nodded. Yes, are you in trouble? No. Am I? He dropped to one knee on the wet path despite the mud. No, he said. You told the truth. That helped me. Then she went into his arms all at once. I looked away. I am not ashamed of that. There are moments too clean to survive direct eye contact after too much ugliness. A father holding his child in full weather after years of approved distance is one of them. Behind us, the law kept working. Adrian asked for counsel. Celeste asked whether this would traumatize Ivy more than our managed arrangement, which is a sentence so poisonous it ought to be bottled and buried. Leah kept directing evidence collection. Carver began inventorying devices, files, and the medication cabinet in the house. And then we found the next layer. In the main house office, inside Celeste's locking file cabinet, beneath holiday receipts and school forms, investigators found a stack of false treatment invoices printed on the Vermont Lodge's outdated template. Different dates, different totals, different fonts used badly enough that even I could see they had been patched by hand. Beside them was a folder labeled East Block Scenarios. Inside were developer proposals, revenue forecasts, demolition sketches for 27 acres of producing trees, and a handwritten note in Celeste's slanted script. If Gabriel's structure finalized by July, signatures move faster and Eli won't fight once tax pressure lands. There it was, my role in her calendar. Not husband's father, not grieving widower, tax pressure. I do not know which enraged me more, the note itself or the matter-of-fact tone, as if removing my son's legal resistance were no different from planning irrigation upgrades. Then came Adrian's laptop. Carver's digital analyst found mirrored intake documents, medication schedules, and a folder of audio recordings. Not therapeutic sessions, not quite. Control reviews. Gabriel responding poorly to child exposure. Father inquiry increasing. Needs stronger burden language. Celeste better at guilt induction than comfort. Marin asking for larger share this quarter. That last line stopped us all. Marin asking for larger share this quarter. It meant not only that Adrian and Celeste knew she was alive, it meant the arrangement was still active, negotiated, profit shared. Carver did not say much. He just looked at Leah and said, "Get me the lake warrant." By then, Celeste's righteous anger had begun collapsing into the thinner, uglier sound of personal inconvenience. She kept asking what Ivy would think, what the orchard board would think, what the school would think. She never once asked what Gabriel had endured. There are confessions that do not need the word yes. Omission can be cleaner than admission when the moral center is gone. As Adrian was walked toward the cruiser, he passed me once on the gravel path. Rain on his coat, hands cuffed. Face gray and furious in a way that finally matched the contents of his soul. "You have no idea what your son was like after the incident," he said quietly. "You are romanticizing a level of deterioration you never had to manage." I stepped closer, not enough to touch, enough that he would have to look directly at me. "No," I said, "you romanticized profit until it sounded like medicine." He looked away first. Marin was picked up 2 hours later, not because justice is magic. Because greedy people repeat logistics. Same lake condo, same vehicle, same predictable desire to retrieve documents and cash before the floor fully vanished beneath them. She tried to leave with a hard-shell suitcase, 2 phones, and a passport application packet under another name. Carver called just after dusk. "We have her." That should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt like weather changing, necessary, final. Not personal enough to satisfy what had been done, but real enough to matter. By nightfall, the canning house had been sealed, the spoon bagged, the notebooks taken, the house itself subject to warrant limits, Celeste and Adrian gone. Marin in custody on linked fraud and conspiracy holds pending fuller charges. Ivy under emergency protective placement that Miriam was already fighting to steer toward me. Gabriel at my house under medical and legal supervision, because after 4 years in managed captivity, you do not simply walk a man into freedom and call it recovery. The first night home, he stood in my kitchen for nearly a full minute before sitting down. Not because the chair was uncomfortable, because ordinary space confused him. He kept glancing toward the door like someone might define the right place for him if he waited long enough. So I pulled out the chair across from mine and said the simplest thing I had. "You can sit wherever you want." He laughed once at that. A real laugh this time. Short and damaged and still somehow his. Then he sat. I made spaghetti sauce because that was the one dinner Nora used to make when the house felt too broken for anything complicated. Too much garlic. Too much confidence. Not enough patience. The kitchen smelled almost like memory, and not enough like the years in between. Ivy colored at the end of the table with the child response worker nearby, and Miriam in the next room arguing custody language on the phone with someone whose title probably made weaker people defer too quickly. No one forced conversation. That mattered. No one demanded gratitude. No one asked Gabriel to perform his own restoration for the comfort of the witnesses. After a while, Ivy slid a sheet of paper across the table. It was a drawing of 3 apple trees, 1 house, and 1 small square building with a red X over it. Above the drawing she had written, in all caps and with the E backward, "No more quiet house." Gabriel looked at it for a long time. Then he put his hand over his mouth and turned toward the sink, because crying in front of your child after captivity has its own kind of shame stitched into it. I pretended to need the sauce spoon. That is all dignity sometimes is. Not solving another person's grief for them. Giving it enough privacy to survive and enough company not to drown. At 1 a.m, after Ivy finally slept on the couch under 3 blankets and Miriam went home for 4 hours of legal rest she did not deserve, Gabriel and I sat in the dark kitchen with cooling coffee between us. He said, "It's strange." "What is?" "The silence." I listened. No spoon, no pipe, no measured steps approaching the door, no waiting for the next correction, just refrigerator hum and old house settling. "Yes," I said, "it is." He nodded. Then, after a long time, he asked the question I knew was still coming, because justice rarely removes the first wound just because it exposes the rest. "What if the shove was enough anyway?" he said. "What if even if Marin was alive later, I still did something that deserved?" He could not finish. I answered the only way truth allowed. Then we looked straight at that too. We don't use one lie to buy another, but whatever happened that night, it did not entitle them to 4 years of this. He stared at the dark window. "I don't know what I am outside their words yet." "No," I said, "but at least they're outside now." That was not healing. Not even close. It was floor. And after years in a room like that, floor matters. The weeks after a rescue are where stories usually lie to you. They show sunlight, coffee, maybe a quiet porch and a long exhale. They make it look as if exposure itself contains repair, as if naming the horror teaches the nervous system to surrender it. It does not. The first week after Gabriel came home, he slept in 40-minute pieces. Sometimes less. If a pipe clicked, he sat up straight. If a spoon hit a pot too sharply in the kitchen, his whole body stiffened before his face caught up. More than once I found him standing in the hallway at 2 a.m. with his hand flat against the wall, not because anyone had told him to do it, but because panic had chosen the oldest available posture. He apologized for everything, for taking too long in the shower, for not finishing food, for staring at the door before sitting down, for waking Ivy with a bad dream, for making the legal process harder, for making me miss work at the orchard, for breathing too loudly during one meeting because Aaron had closed a file drawer behind him and his body had not yet learned the difference between office sound and command cue. Manipulation leaves fingerprints in places no jury ever sees. A week after the arrests, Ivy asked if the Canning house was angry now that the police had locked it. That is what children do. They turn structures into personalities because adults have spent too much time behaving like weather. Gabriel sat beside her on the couch and answered carefully. "Buildings don't get angry," he said. "People do." She thought about that for a while. Then she asked, "So was it a bad people house?" He looked at me. I looked back. Then he answered the question better than I could have. "It was a place where bad people put bad rules," he said. "That's different from the building being alive. We can change what happens to a building." That line mattered later. At first, though, everything practical came fast. Emergency placement for Ivy, protective order extension, asset freeze requests, interim medical review for Gabriel, independent psychiatric assessment from someone who had never met Adrian and had no financial interest in finding treatment wherever it was profitable. 100 pages of forms just to establish that a man held in a quasi-therapeutic private room might need help making ordinary choices, again without that being grounds to erase him further. Miriam lived at our house half the week by then. Files at the end of the table, printer running, tea cooling, legal language everywhere. She said once, not looking up from her laptop, "The law is terrible at speed and excellent at paperwork. Unfortunately, victims usually need the reverse." Carver spent most of the second week taking formal statements, mine, Gabriel's, Ivy's in a child-appropriate forensic setting, Frank's, Dennis's, Aaron's chain of custody on the recordings, Leah's evidence map. By then, Marin had started cooperating, not because conscience arrived. Conscience almost never arrives on time in people like that. Because Harbor Lantern's records, the false invoice templates, and the live recording from the Canning house made loyalty more expensive than self-preservation. Her first proffer session ran nearly 5 hours. We got the broad truth before we got the full one. Yes, Marin had survived the shove with a scalp wound and brief loss of consciousness. Yes, Adrian had known immediately she was alive. Yes, Celeste arrived within minutes. Yes, they understood almost at once how catastrophically guilt-ridden Gabriel already was after Nora's death and the East Block fights. Yes, Adrian proposed that if Gabriel could be stabilized under confidentiality, the family could avoid scandal and buy time. Yes, within that same night, the idea had shifted from temporary concealment to structured leverage. That phrase was Marin's, structured leverage. She said Adrian used it first. Apparently, he believed most people do not need physical cages if you can locate the exact shame that makes them volunteer for one. He said Gabriel was ideal because his guilt responded to authority, his love for Ivy could be harnessed, his father had money, and the family was already weakened by recent bereavement. I am giving you his logic without polish. It did not deserve polish, even when he was speaking it. Marin claimed she did not understand at first how long the arrangement would last. I am sure some part of that was true. Predators rarely reveal the entire staircase to one another on day one, but she understood enough to take the money when it started arriving. She also told us something that made Gabriel sit down hard when Leah relayed it later. The first time he was taken from the Canning house to Vermont, he was heavily sedated. He signed intake forms, yes, but he also asked twice to call me, twice. Both times Adrian noted in his chart that paternal contact would deepen self-punishing ideation and produce destabilizing rescue fantasies. That phrase made me physically ill, because the only fantasy in the room had belonged to Adrian. The fantasy that a man with a degree and a folder full of soft words could reorganize a family's moral reality and call it treatment, as long as he invoiced carefully enough. Marin's fuller statement gave us the original motive more clearly. Celeste had been furious for over a year that I refused to approve the East Block development. The old tasting barn and the ridge above it overlooked enough of the Lake Effect Valley to attract serious resort money. There had already been informal conversations with investors, one of whom Marin brought into the picture through hospitality contacts. Celeste saw the orchard as a legacy asset waiting to be monetized. Gabriel saw it as producing land with a future tied to trees, not cabins. When Nora died, Celeste assumed I would weaken. Maybe she was right for a time, but grief did not turn me into a land seller quickly enough. Then Gabriel found draft easement language and confronted Marin. The fight happened in the Canning house because that was where some event storage and old files were kept. Marin admitted, during the proffer, that she pushed him too, that she wanted him angry because she had learned through Celeste that his anger often collapsed into guilt faster than anyone's. She called it using his own weight against him. I hope she spends the rest of her life hating the precision of that line. The injury itself was real. The blood was real. The lie started in the interpretation. Adrian checked her, realized she was alive, and in the space between examination and explanation decided the moment could be repurposed. By the time he told Gabriel she was gone, the crime had already shifted categories. No longer concealment. Engineering. Celeste's contribution was not panic. It was operational instinct. She saw immediately how Gabriel's love for Ivy could be turned into compliance, how my grief for Nora could be turned into funding, how public scandal around an alleged death could be kept hovering just out of reach as long as Gabriel believed visibility meant destruction. Once Adrian introduced treatment language, Celeste became its best local translator. Once the money arrived, Marin demanded her share. Once the East Block sale became a longer game, Gabriel's room became permanent. When Leah gave us the clean summary of that statement, Gabriel did not speak for almost a full hour. Then he asked, did she ever once ask about Ivy while she was taking the money? Leah checked the transcript. No. He nodded once and looked down at his hands. Again, no speeches, no dramatic collapse. There is a kind of devastation too exhausted to perform itself in front of others. It just sits. The independent psychiatrist, Dr. Lena Flores, met Gabriel 3 times over 10 days and undid more damage with careful honesty than Adrian had done good with all his curated language in years. She did not promise quick recovery, did not flatter him by calling him resilient on day one, did not lean on therapy jargon like it was moral furniture. She said things like, what was adaptive in the room may not be adaptive here. Conditioned fear is not consent. You are allowed to distrust your own memory in the places somebody else profited from shaping it. Guilt can be real and still be exploited. You do not need to solve your whole identity before lunch. That last line almost made Gabriel smile. Dr. Flores also confirmed what we already suspected. He had likely been over-medicated intermittently, especially during periods when the petition drafts were revised or when my annual transfers were due, not sedated into oblivion. Again, that would have been easier to spot and less sustainable. Instead, medicated just enough to flatten challenge, intensify fatigue, and keep doubt pointed inward. That pattern mattered because it turned the legal case from ugly family manipulation into something sharper. A physician using medication not merely to treat, but to maintain exploitable dependency. The bond hearing for Celeste and Adrian took place in a room with bad fluorescent light and the smell of damp coats. I did not want to attend. I attended anyway because I had spent too long letting distance substitute for responsibility. Celeste wore county clothes and no makeup. Without the polish, she looked what she was, not monstrous in the theatrical sense. Just disciplined and entitled enough to believe other lives could be arranged around her convenience indefinitely. Adrian looked smaller. Degrees and cufflinks had always done a lot of his visible work. Without them, he was just a man with careful diction and a deep investment in his own exceptionalism. Their attorneys tried every predictable angle. No unlawful confinement because Gabriel had initially agreed to treatment. No fraud because support money was used broadly in service of care continuity. No malicious deception because Marin's temporary disappearance had been part of a crisis management error that later spiraled. No child exploitation, merely badly judged boundaries. No coercion, only misguided therapeutic overreach. Guidance like that is why I am grateful Miriam exists. She hears nonsense and does not mistake its grammar for intellect. Leah answered point by point. Recorded admissions, false invoices, concealed living arrangement, benefit diversion, child-linked reward system, proxy petition, medication pattern, Marin's statement, independent psychiatric review, actual physical control of the room, actual window latches, actual cue object, actual financial transfers into shell entities. The judge denied immediate release. I do not pretend the moment felt holy. It felt practical. And practical justice has its own beauty when you have watched polished people call cages care for long enough. Outside the courthouse, local reporters gathered because small towns treat orchard families, scandal, and child endangerment as a weather event if the names are old enough. I had no wish to talk. Miriam said I had to say something before Celeste's lawyer found a microphone first. So I stood on the courthouse steps, under low cloud, and said exactly what the case deserved, and no more. My son needed grief, treatment, and truth. He was given control, deception, and a room. The orchard will survive. The people hurt by this deserve privacy while the law does its work. Then I stepped back inside because I was not going to let cameras turn our pain into a convenience for strangers. The orchard board meeting came 3 weeks later. That mattered for reasons beyond public image. Banks, wholesalers, insurance, payroll, scholarship funds in Nora's name. The East Block easement rumors had already started to spread because greed always leaks before justice is finished with it. For 30 years, I had chaired those meetings with the same bad coffee and the same stubborn hope that if I kept the books honest, the land would keep us all within one moral fence line. I no longer believe that exactly, but I did believe one thing. If Celeste and Adrian had built their scam partly on the assumption that I would keep the orchard clean at all costs, then part of my revenge was going to be refusing the old cleanliness. Not lying, not smoothing, not saving face for the people who tried to hollow us out from inside. So I told the board the truth, not every private detail, not Ivy's fear, not the worst notebook lines, not Gabriel's night standing with his hand against the wall, but enough to explain why Celeste's signing authority was revoked. Enough to explain why every East Block discussion was frozen indefinitely. Enough to explain why Harbor Lantern and Vale-linked entities would face civil action. Enough to explain why my own previous support transfers had been diverted through shell structures. Enough to make every man at that table understand that polished language had nearly stripped our producing land from the family through a captive heir and a doctor with invoices. Then I did the most satisfying administrative thing of my life. I placed a new set of corporate papers on the table and said, effective today, no sale, lease, or restructuring of the East Block can occur without joint approval from me, Gabriel Rowan, and the protective trust established for Ivy Rowan. No one spoke for a second. Then old Martin Kessler, who had argued for event money once and learned enough from this case to feel shame properly, asked, Eli, are you saying the land is locked? Yes, I said. I am saying greed has been pruned out of the voting structure. That line made Dennis cough into his coffee because, for once, a metaphor and a legal mechanism had aligned almost perfectly. The protective trust had been Miriam's idea, not to replace Gabriel, not to infantilize him again, to prevent another predator from exploiting the messy middle between immediate rescue and full restoration. Ivy was the obvious long-term beneficiary. Gabriel, once stabilized and reviewed independent of coercion, would regain direct authority through staged restoration. The East Block, the very thing Celeste had tried to use as future cash, became the one part of the orchard no opportunist could flip quickly ever again. That was revenge too. Not glamorous, precise. Take the thing they wanted most and make it require the consent of the people they tried to erase. The civil side of revenge takes longer than the criminal side. That is one of the first lessons you learn if you have ever owned land, employed families, or mistaken a smile for a safeguard. Criminal court asks whether a wrong happened under law. Civil court asks who paid for it, who profited from it, and how much of the damage can be forced back through paper and time. Miriam pursued both with the cold joy of a woman who had finally found a target worthy of her file tabs. We sued for fraudulent inducement, diversion of support funds, breach of fiduciary obligations under falsely claimed care authority, and interference with Gabriel's property interests. Dennis traced every routed dollar like a hound. The condo, the furnishing upgrades, consulting reimbursements, Adrian's administrative continuity transfers, Marin's quarterly share asks, travel, even a set of winter spa charges that had been reimbursed through a wellness shell in the same month. Celeste told me Gabriel needed increased observation because he was spiraling around anniversaries. That last one made Miriam smile the way knives probably smile when sharpened. Anniversaries, she said, sliding the statement across the table. Apparently a very expensive medical condition. By then, Gabriel had started helping at the orchard again in microscopic doses. Not full days, not ladders, not heavy machinery. Dr. Flores was explicit about that. You do not hand a freshly released captive a pruning pole and call it restoration because he remembers how it used to feel in his hands. Instead, he sorted tags, checked inventory counts, walked blocks with me without obligation to fill the silence, stood in the cider room and relearned that the rhythm of equipment could belong to work rather than command. The first morning he asked if he could ride with me to the north storage barn. I nearly said yes too quickly and turned the moment into pressure. So I only asked, "Do you want to?" He considered that like it was an unfamiliar kind of permission. "Yes," he said. "All right." He sat in the truck with both hands flat on his thighs for the first 10 minutes. Then the old instincts started returning. Not the bad ones, the useful ones. He glanced at the block reports, asked why row 6 in the Macintosh stand still showed lower yield, mentioned that the replacement hinges on the west cooler door would not last another season. Not a miracle. A man remembering the shape of his own competence. Ivy healed in her own patterns. She slept with the hallway light on for a month, refused copper utensils entirely for a while, asked whether bad people could still give good birthday presents, and if so, whether keeping them meant the bad got back in. Children ask theology questions through objects. That is something adults forget. Miriam answered that one best. You can throw away anything that smells like control, she told Ivy. Goodness does not need souvenirs from people who used fear. So Ivy and I spent a whole Saturday clearing boxes from the mudroom attic and garage, old decorations, kitchenware, storage bins, Celeste's monogrammed nonsense, Adrian's donated books on resilience that had somehow made their way into the house because manipulative men always want their vocabulary visible in every room. At the bottom of one kitchen crate, we found 2 more copper preserving spoons from Nora's canning days. Ivy froze when she saw them. Gabriel, standing in the doorway, went pale. I almost said we should throw them out. But something in me resisted letting fear own metal that had belonged to my wife before it ever belonged to a Q system. So I took them from the box, held them up and said, "These are Nora's, not theirs. Objects don't stay guilty if the wrong hands borrowed them." Ivy thought about that, then nodded once. We kept the spoons, but not the one from the canning house. That one remained in evidence until the case was over. The criminal case built steadily. Marin's plea cooperation hardened the center. She admitted to accepting staged disappearance money, helping maintain the fiction of her own death, and knowingly allowing Gabriel's guilt to be used as leverage for both financial extraction and land strategy. She claimed she believed Adrian would eventually transition him out gently. Maybe she did. Maybe that was the last small story she told herself to keep sleeping. I no longer cared which. The worst part of her testimony for Gabriel was not the money, not even the fake death. It was hearing that Ivy's drawings had been discussed by adults at a dining table as maintenance tools. That phrase came out of Marin's mouth during deposition with the absent mind of someone who had not yet fully realized how monstrous ordinary words can sound once daylight gets them. Maintenance tools. His daughter's drawings. Maintenance tools. Gabriel asked for a break then, and went out behind the courthouse where the dumpsters sat. I followed at a distance and found him with both hands braced against the brick wall, breathing hard. She was 6, he said. 6 when they started sliding drawings under the door and calling it treatment. I stood beside him, not touching, just there. Yes, I said. He stared at the wet asphalt. I keep trying to figure out which part should hurt worst. Marin alive, Adrian lying, Celeste using Ivy, the money, Mom dying while I was 50 yards from my own daughter's yard. Every time I think I've found the worst part, another piece moves. That may keep happening, I said. Does it stop? No, I answered. But it changes. Some pain stops being the room you live in and becomes the weather you know how to dress for. He laughed once, the old dry tone almost visible. That sounds like something you would say while pretending it's wisdom and not exhaustion. That's because it's both. He nodded, then asked if we could go home. Home. He had started using the word, not always, enough. That summer, the canning house became the center of a fight I had not expected. Not legal, moral. Some people told me to tear it down immediately, burn the thing, flatten it, remove every board, let no part of it keep standing as if ordinary use could ever return there. Others, including Gabriel at first, wanted it untouched until sentencing because destroying it felt too much like giving the worst year's final authority over the structure. I did not know what I wanted. I knew what I hated. The wall, the inner room, the vent, the sealed pane, the nail where the spoon hung. But I also knew what the building had been before any of that. My grandmother's preserves, Nora's late-season jars, autumn steam, apricot halved on flour sack towels, a place of work before it became a place of private command. So I left it sealed until the case moved. That decision turned out to be right. At sentencing, Leah used photographs of the room, the cue spoon, the binders, the petition, the invoices, and the handwriting examples to give the judge not just a legal record, but a physical one. Not because the law needed theater, because human minds still understand walls better than abstract harm. Adrian went first. His lawyer spoke for 20 minutes about clinical misjudgment, boundary failures, overreach under pressure, and a man who lost perspective while trying to help a family in crisis. When it was Gabriel's turn to speak, he stood slowly, one hand on the back of the chair, and said a sentence I will remember until I die. "You did not lose perspective," he told Adrian. "You found a man in grief and calculated his market value." Nothing louder than that was needed. Adrian received a sentence heavy enough to matter and light enough to prove the law still struggles with crimes that leave most of their bruises on memory rather than skin. Still, his license was gone. His name stripped from the professional world he had used as cover. His practice dissolved into exhibits and forfeiture language. His condo entity seized. His notes entered permanently into a record that would outlive his curated vocabulary. For a man like Adrian, that mattered nearly as much as prison. Celeste's sentencing came a week later. Her lawyer tried motherhood, tried stress, tried the impossible weight of running an orchard household beside a deteriorating husband and grieving father-in-law. Some of it was true. That is the part bad defense strategies rely on. They weave real strain into monstrous choice and hope the court confuses explanation with mitigation. When the judge asked whether she wished to address the court, Celeste stood straight and said, "I made difficult decisions in impossible conditions." Gabriel leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. I knew why, because that sentence was the whole architecture in miniature. She would rather die than call what she did by its living name. The judge was not sentimental, thank God. He said, "Difficult decisions do not include using a child as a compliance device." Then he sentenced her. Again, not enough to balance the years. Enough to matter. Enough that she walked out in custody while the orchard still stood, and the East Block remained under the protection of the very people she had tried to reduce to signatures and leverage. Marin's deal required testimony and restitution. Her condo interest vanished. Her share claims evaporated. She was left with supervised release, debt, and a public record tying her name to one of the ugliest small conspiracies our county had seen in years. That may sound light to some people, maybe it was, but I will say this. There are women like Marin who build their whole reflected life on fluidity. A new story here, a new man there, a new room with better light and no one remembering the old damage. Restitution, testimony, and a searchable record are harsher on people like that than many forms of punishment. Every event contract she ever reaches for will now have to pass under the shadow of the words she once used for a child's drawings. Maintenance tools. Let her live with them. My own revenge was never going to end in a courtroom anyway. It happened in smaller, more exact places. In the Orchard boardroom, where I locked the East Block against opportunists. In the bank, where Harbor Lantern's accounts were frozen under my civil claim. In the scholarship letter, where Nora's music fund removed Celeste's name from every donor page and replaced it with one line, established in honor of Nora Rowan, whose instincts deserved to be trusted sooner. In the employment meeting where I told the senior staff the truth about forged invoices so no one would have to choose between gossip and false loyalty. In the local paper interview I finally gave 6 months later, where I did not make the story pretty for anyone. I said, "My son was not saved by silence. He was nearly buried by it." That line spread farther than I expected. Church ladies repeated it. Farm families repeated it. People in town who had once half believed Celeste's martyr performance stopped using her name as if it were shorthand for sacrifice. That is a form of revenge too, not slander. Correction. And then there was the canning house. After sentencing, I asked Gabriel what he wanted done with it. He surprised me. "Open the window first," he said. "That's all?" "That's the first thing." So we went there together on an August morning when the orchard smelled like warm leaves and dust and apples just beginning to sweeten. The county seal had been cleared, the evidence process finished, the inner partition still stood, the room still carried its old layered smell of damp, bleach, metal, and waiting. Gabriel walked in and stopped beside the sealed pane. He touched the frame once, then twice. "Frank can fix this," I said. He shook his head. "No, I want to do it." So I got him tools, not because the gesture was symbolic, because symbols matter more when your hands are allowed to do the work themselves. He removed the screws slowly, window by window, latch by latch, vent grate after vent grate. The first real rush of outside air into that back room made the curtain lift for the first time in years. Ivy stood at the door with ear protection on because the drill was loud. She watched the curtain move and whispered, "It's breathing." Gabriel set the screwdriver down and looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Now it is." We did not tear the building down. That is not the ending we chose. We tore out the inner room. We tore out the digital lock. We tore out the wall it had created. We ripped up the flooring that covered anchor points. We hauled the bed to the dump. We sanded the desk. We painted over every scuff. We widened the window openings and restored the old cross breeze Nora loved during canning season. By October, the building was no longer a private punishment box. It was a preserving kitchen again. Not exactly what it had been. It could never be exactly that. But it returned to use rather than surrender. I think that mattered for all of us. Evil counts on permanent contamination. It wants to make every room it touched feel unavailable forever. Sometimes the cleanest refusal is not burning the structure. It is taking it back so thoroughly the old purpose can no longer breathe there. The first autumn after everything broke open was the strangest season of my life. Not the saddest. I had already lived through watching Nora run out of breath one measured inch at a time. Not the angriest. The canning house had taken that title and kept it. Not even the most exhausting, though custody review, therapy schedules, harvest forecasts, and civil filings tried hard. No, it was strangest because life insisted on continuing while all of us were still learning how to stand in it without the old commands. Apples still needed picking. Invoices still needed paying. Bins still jammed if loaded by fools. Rain still arrived, whether the human heart had caught up to truth or not. The orchard did not pause because our family had been split open. In a way, that helped. Labor can be mercy when memory becomes too circular. Gabriel came back in stages. First inventory, then forklift observation without touching controls, then 2 hours in the press room with another manager present, then payroll review because numbers had once been one of the places he felt most like himself. And Dennis said careful competence is often a better stabilizer than inspirational slogans. He had good weeks and ugly days. On good weeks, he laughed more often. Not loudly. Still, the same dry, sideways laugh that comes half a beat before the full smile. He would notice a mislabeled crate from 20 feet away. He would correct my old habit of over-ordering gaskets. He would tease Ivy for drawing tractors with wheels larger than the barns. On ugly days, a phrase or sound could still send him somewhere inward. A metal spoon dropped at the right angle. A file folder set on a desk with too much force. Someone saying the word comply in a totally innocent context. A doctor's office waiting room. A closed door with no visible handle from the inside. Any mention of family burden in a podcast or sermon or social media clip somebody forgot to turn off. Sometimes he would stand in the cider room staring at the tanks, as if trying to remember whether he had once loved routine or only learned to fear anything with repeated sound. Dr. Flores prepared me for all of it. She said, "Recovery after coercive control is not a stair-step. It's weather. The goal is not no storms. The goal is a house that does not collapse when they come." There was that word again. House. Maybe that is why I trusted her. She understood structure without trying to weaponize it. Ivy came back in her own stages too. At first, she still whispered in the canning kitchen even after the inner wall was gone. Then one Saturday in October, while Nora's old peach kettle steamed again and cinnamon hung in the air, she shouted from the sink, "Grandpa, where do we keep more jars?" The sound hit all of us at once. Loud, ordinary, unafraid. Gabriel put down the lid wrench and looked at me. I looked at him. No one said anything because some victories are best left unannounced while they are still landing. Later that night, he sat on the back steps with a mug of cider and said, "She was yelling. Yes, in there. Yes." And no one corrected her. No. He laughed softly. Good. He had started saying good to small freedoms. That taught me something. People who have lost large freedoms often recover through tiny ones first. Open windows, unscheduled walks, doors without instruction, the right to leave a sentence unfinished, the right to say no to tea. I would not have known that before. Now I know it the way I know frost by smell. One of the more difficult pieces arrived in November when Ivy asked whether she had loved her mother wrong. We were decorating the front porch for the school harvest drive. pumpkins, cornstalks, a sign Nora used to paint every year until arthritis made the brush too heavy. Ivy was tying ribbon badly around a basket handle when she asked it. "Can you love somebody right?" she said, "and they still use it wrong?" I set the twine down because that is not a question you answer while pretending your hands are still the main thing happening. "Yes," I said. She frowned. "Then how do you know if love is safe?" Gabriel had come up the steps behind us without my hearing him. He answered before I could. "Safe love lets you ask questions," he said. She looked at him. "What if they get mad?" "Safe love can get mad," he said. "It just doesn't make your questions into your fault." That answer was so good I almost hated him for growing into wisdom through a route that cruel. But that is parenthood too, I suppose. Watching your child say something truer than you knew how to when it cost them too much to learn it. By Christmas, the emergency placement had become shared permanent arrangement pending final family court closure. Celeste's parental rights were not erased entirely at once because the law moves slower than damage and sometimes confuses biology with entitlement. But her contact was stripped down to supervised written channels while therapeutic review continued. That may sound mild to some. It was, in practical terms, the collapse of the one mechanism she had trusted most. Her access to Ivy as a moral shield vanished. She could no longer speak through the child, could no longer turn the child into evidence of her own goodness. That mattered. Marin's restitution payments began under court order. Adrian's assets were liquidated in part. My civil claim recovered more money than I expected and less than justice would have demanded if justice counted years honestly. I took every dollar that came back and divided it the only way that felt clean. Part to Gabriel's long-term care and legal restoration fund, part to Ivy's education trust, part to the orchard worker hardship account Nora had once wanted to expand. Because if greed had fed on our pain, then restitution needed to do more than return principal. It needed to nourish what greed had tried to starve. That, too, was revenge, turning stolen care money into actual care. In early January, I finally opened the small cedar chest at the foot of my bed, where Nora kept personal notes she never intended as household instructions. For months after her death, I had not been ready. Then the case came, then the rescue, then the court machinery. Life kept delaying the box. Inside were recipe cards, concert programs, one photograph of Gabriel at 9 missing a front tooth and holding a bucket of bruised apples like treasure, and one envelope with my name on it, just Eli, no flourish. Inside was a single page in Nora's hand. "If I go before things make sense again, do not let grief turn you into an obedient man. You are at your worst when somebody calmer than you sounds certain. Ask where. Ask who saw it. Ask what paper proves it. Ask even if it embarrasses you. Especially then." I sat on the bed and read that 3 times. There is no point pretending that note felt like comfort. It felt like indictment, written by the only person I would have trusted enough to accept it from. The next day I took it to the canning kitchen and read it aloud to Gabriel while he labeled jars. He listened with his head down, then he said, "She knew." "Yes." "She tried to tell you." "Yes," he nodded. Then after a long pause, "You're here now." Sometimes forgiveness enters the room disguised as a sentence too simple to feel earned. In March, 1 year after the arrests, the Orchard hosted the county school music fundraiser again. Not because I was feeling symbolic, because Nora's scholarship had always mattered, and I refused to let Celeste's use of that event space contaminate Nora's name permanently. The evening was mild. Strings of warm lights between the maples, tables set out in the barn, student quartets cycling through clumsy, earnest arrangements that would have made Nora grin even while adjusting tempo under her breath. I worried about Gabriel all day. Crowds, noise, parents from town. The barn where Celeste once pitched event packages over cider and false charm. Too many collisions between old and new. Dr. Flores told me not to protect him into smallness. So I asked once in the morning, "Do you want to be there?" He thought for a second and said, "Yes, but I may need air." "Take all you want." That was it. No speeches, no pep talk. He came in after dusk with Ivy beside him and took a seat near the wall at first because walls still helped. Then he stood when the 6th graders butchered a fiddle tune so magnificently that even the judges had to laugh. Then he carried 2 trays of cider cups without being asked. Then he disappeared outside for 10 minutes when somebody dropped a serving spoon and the sound landed wrong. Then he came back in on his own. Progress is not linear. It still counts. Near the end of the evening, the principal asked whether I wanted to say a few words about Nora's scholarship. I said yes before I thought too hard and then regretted it for 3 minutes until I remembered regret is not always a stop sign. So I stood on the little platform by the barn doors and looked out at parents, teachers, staff, volunteers, kids in shoes already muddy from the yard, and my son holding a stack of programs while my granddaughter leaned into his side like she had relearned that gravity could be kind. I said this: My wife Nora believed music taught children how to hold feeling without turning it into damage. She also believed adults fail most often when we stop asking ordinary questions because we are afraid of embarrassing ourselves. This scholarship is in her name because she told the truth even when the room preferred comfort. If there's anything I've learned this year, it's that love without questions is not always love. Sometimes it's just permission wearing a kind face. So ask. Ask where. Ask how. Ask who checked. Ask what the paper says. And if someone tells you questions are the problem, ask anyway. The barn went very quiet. Then the applause started. Not loud at first, then louder. I did not care much about that. What I cared about was the look on Gabriel's face. Not pride exactly. Recognition. Like he could finally hear our family speaking in a voice that had not been borrowed from fear. After the fundraiser, we all walked down toward the canning kitchen because Ivy wanted to show her friend Emily that the new window shelves were where the peach is cool now. That sentence alone would have been enough to make the whole year worth carrying. Inside, the counters were full of empty jars waiting for spring. The big kettle sat polished. Nora's old radio, repaired badly but faithfully by me, hummed low in the corner. Emily pointed at the window over the sink and asked why it opened so wide. Ivy answered before any adult could ruin it. So air can move through. Yes, that was the answer, not for symbolism, though of course it was symbolic, for air, for sound, for ordinary life refusing again to be regulated into silence. Later, after everyone left, Gabriel stayed behind to lock up with me. He ran his hand along the counter, where Marin's blood had once been staged into a death sentence, and said, "I used to think the opposite of a lie was proof. What do you think now?" He looked around the room, at the open windows, at the stacked jars, at the radio, at the place where Ivy had been laughing too loudly only 10 minutes earlier. "Use," he said. "I think the opposite of what they did is honest use. A room gets used honestly, money gets used honestly, love gets used honestly. That may be the smartest thing anyone in my family has ever said about what happened, because he was right. The lie was never just words. It was theft of purpose. A room stolen from work, a child stolen into leverage, medicine stolen into control, money stolen from care, grief stolen into billing, land stolen towards speculation. The opposite had to be more than exposure. It had to be restoration of purpose. That is what we spent the year doing. Not every day well, not every conversation cleanly, but steadily. Steady is underrated. Steady saves orchards. Steady raises children. Steady survives weather. And after enough chaos, steady can feel almost holy. One Sunday in early summer, a little more than a year after Ivy slipped that concert program into my hand, the three of us ate dinner on the back porch while rain moved across the west field in slow silver sheets. Not because the moment was perfect, because the weather was warm enough and none of us wanted walls that evening. I had grilled chicken badly in Cornwell. Gabriel had fixed the porch step I kept pretending was fine. Ivy had spent 20 minutes explaining why a future farm dog should be named Pencil, which is not a serious name for a dog, but apparently that no longer matters if the argument is delivered with enough conviction. At one point, while I was carrying plates inside, I looked back through the open screen door and saw my son laughing at something his daughter had said. Not the careful laugh he used in the first months after coming home. Not the one that checked the room before it arrived. A real one. Brief. Unmanaged. His own. That image is the one I keep. Not the arrest. Not the bond hearings. Not even the day the inner wall came out of the canning house. I keep the laugh. Because captivity trains you to mistake dramatic exits for the whole story. They are not. The whole story is what a person sounds like once no one is charging rent on his breath anymore. This story began with a whisper in a church. "Grandpa, stop paying Mom. Dad isn't in Vermont. Dad is in the canning house. When the copper spoon rings, he has to put his face to the wall." I used to think the opposite of a lie was simply the truth. Now I think the opposite of a lie is return. Return to your own language. Return to the child who was turned into leverage. Return to a room that belongs to work again. Return to money that does not have to pass through shame before it becomes useful. Return to a table where no one has to earn the right to sit by obeying. The law did its work. The evidence did its work. The recordings did their work. Miriam's legal fury did its work. Carver and Leah and Dennis and Aaron and Dr. Flores all did the work they were built for. But the real ending happened smaller than that. A child finally told the truth and was believed. A father stopped mistaking calm language for moral authority. A man came back from a room built out of other people's excuses, and an old building behind an orchard lost the worst purpose ever nailed into it. That is the ending worth keeping. If this story hit you hard, maybe it should. Family betrayal rarely arrives wearing a villain's face. Sometimes it arrives wearing concern, credentials, and the exact tone of voice you most want to trust. If someone keeps telling you that asking ordinary questions will hurt the people you love, ask anyway. especially then. And if you ever hear a child whisper the truth like it might cost them something, believe them faster than I did. That is the full story. 1. Why Gabriel was hidden. Because Celeste, Adrian, and Marin used the fake death lie and Gabriel's guilt to keep him compliant, fund their lifestyle, and clear the path to control his property rights and the East Orchard land. 2. What really happened to Marin. Gabriel shoved her during a fight. She was injured, but she did not die. Adrian saw the opportunity, lied, and the three of them turned the accident into a long con. 3. Why Elias kept paying. Because he was told Gabriel was in specialized treatment and because grief, guilt, and trust made him easier to manipulate every harvest season. 4. Why Ivy mattered. She was the leverage point. Her drawings, voice, and limited proximity were used to control Gabriel. Then she becomes the person who breaks the lie by telling the truth. 5. What the copper spoon meant. It was a command cue used to force silence and compliance. Later, it becomes evidence, and the family takes back the meaning of the old kitchen tools by reclaiming the canning house itself. 6. Why the canning house mattered. It was both the site of the original manipulation and the long-term holding place. In the end, the inner room is removed, and the building is restored, which closes the symbolic arc. 7. What happened to Celeste? She loses custody leverage, public image, signing authority, access to the orchard plan, and her freedom. 8. What happened to Adrian? He loses professional credibility, license, money, case control, and his freedom. His medical language is exposed as a business tool for coercion. 9. What happened to Marin? She is caught alive, forced into testimony, loses the condo arrangement and money protection, and ends up with legal consequences tied to the fraud. 10. What happened to the orchard? It survives. The East Block is protected. Ownership is restructured so the same scheme can never happen again through quick signatures or manipulated incapacity. 11. What happened to Gabriel emotionally? He is not magically healed. He struggles with open space, sound cues, shame, and identity, but he regains agency, truth, fatherhood, and meaningful work. 12. What happened to Ivy emotionally? She is reassured that telling the truth helped rather than destroyed the family. She slowly relearns safety, voice, and normal life. 13. What happened to Nora's role in the story? Her intuition is validated. Her warnings mattered. Elias finally understands how right she was, which closes the emotional line around his late wife.